Now, back when he was one of the good guys, this is even before they called him the Atlas of Independence, writing back in 1763, John Adams said, "I would quarrel with both parties and with every individual of each, before I would subjugate my understanding or prostitute my tongue or pen to either."
As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
Now let's take a more detailed look at some of his metaphysical ideas. Let's go back to the subject of universals and particulars. You recall that I said that for Aristotle, everything which exists is a particular, it's a this, and it's also a certain kind of thing. As such, it has common properties which it shares with other things on the basis of which we can classify. So that there are two elements comprising each thing. The particularizing or individuating element, that which makes it a this, which Aristotle called matter, and the common or universalizing element, which he called form. Two aspects which are separable in thought, but not in reality. Now let's go on from here. Aristotle asks, in effect, can we specify more clearly what we mean by matter and form? Matter we know as what makes a thing a particular, this. It's the principle of individuation. But what is it about a thing which is unique to it? What is it within a given thing that is the element responsible for its particularity? What makes a thing particular? And equally, he said, we say that form is what makes a thing such, what makes it a kind of thing. But what is this element that is responsible for universality? What is the element in common? So we want now, in effect, to perform a metaphysical dissection of things into two elements and say exactly what they are. Now, to understand Aristotle's answer, imagine that I confront you with a field of bricks. This is, in effect, my own example, but it's his point. And I ask you to build me a number of houses out of these bricks. Well, you take one lot of the bricks, you put them together in a certain way, and you have a house. Now, notice I said you put them together in a certain way. You give the bricks a certain structure. That's what makes it a house. Took the same bricks and put them together differently, you'd have a bridge or a fence or a table or whatever, but not a house. Now suppose you take another lot of bricks and you make another house. So on. What is common? Let us suppose you build 10 houses. What is common to them all? The same structure, the same pattern of organization, the same way of relating the elements, the bricks. And that's why they're all houses rather than bridges, tables, etc. But now suppose we point to one particular house and say, well, what makes this house this one as distinct from all the others? Well, the obvious answer would be, well, it's made of this lot of bricks rather than that lot of bricks. The stuff of this house, the matter of it, is different and unique to it. The structure is common and makes it a house. The stuff or material is unique and makes it this house. Now we could descend a little deeper and do the same thing with the bricks. Take any individual brick. It too is made of some stuff, some material. Suppose cement. Now what makes it this brick rather than that one? Well, it was made out of this glob of, let us suppose, cement rather than that glob. What makes it a brick? In other words, a certain kind of thing? Well, the structure or organization of the cement, as against making out of that same cement a statue, a vase, etc. In general, says Aristotle, everything is made of some stuff, some material. And that material is organized, structured, formed in some particular way. The form, which is now synonymous with the structure, is what gives the thing its character, its suchness, its classification. The material or stuff is what's unique to it, what makes it this particular instance of its class, as against all others. And therefore, Aristotle identifies the universal particular distinction with the structure-stuff distinction. Universal comes from structure, particularity from stuff. And so form and matter come now to mean structure, stuff. A very, very crucial point of his with which objectivism does not agree. Now, if this is the basis for all universals, as it is for Aristotle, then obviously the concepts of stuff and structure must mean more than just physical stuff and spatial structure, as in the examples I've given so far of the bricks and the houses. Because there are universals of things other than physical entities like bricks and houses. So we have to extremely broaden now our notion of what we mean by matter. Matter for Aristotle is going to mean any content, any stuffing, any filling, so to speak, of any kind. And form is going to mean any structure, any organization, any pattern of relationships that is imposed on that filling or stuffing, in virtue of which the thing has some specific nature. Now take a completely non-physical example. Two syllogisms. The Socrates one, which I quoted and won't take the time to repeat, and I'll make up another one. All bright students get an A in this course, assuming I were giving it a grade. You are a bright student, therefore you get an A in this course. Now these are each a particular syllogism, this one plus the Socrates one, and each is a syllogism. Well, what makes it a syllogism? What is the common denominator? Well, obviously the structure of the terms. In each case, we have three terms. One is the middle, one is the minor, one is the major. The organization is the same. That's what makes it a syllogism. But what makes the Socrates syllogism this one as against the getting an A syllogism that one? Well, obviously, the stuffing is different. In other words, the particular terms. The terms of one are Socrates, man and mortal, and of the other, bright student, get an A, and you. You get the idea. Stuff and structure here mean the content of the terms and the organization. And that's why, to this day, Aristotelian logic is called formal logic, because Aristotle's discovery was that the validity of your reasoning, the validity, depends exclusively upon the form, on the structure. Doesn't make any difference what the content is. If it's organized a certain way, the conclusion has to follow. That, of course, doesn't mean the conclusion is necessarily true if the premises are wrong. But simply on the technical question of does the conclusion follow, it's dictated by form, not by matter. And to this day, therefore, courses in logic that teach Aristotle's view are called formal logic.
So as tensions are soaring in the Middle East due to the brutal Israeli assault on Gaza, U.S. officials are warning that President Biden's decisions could lead to a major regional war. So U.S. officials told HuffPost that if Israel provokes a full-blown war in southern Lebanon, the consequences could be catastrophic. And this is one U.S. official talking about war games that the Pentagon has been doing. This official said, quote, "Every scenario shows this would escalate into something terrible, whether in terms of counterterrorism or war with Iran," end quote. The official said that many in the Biden administration fear unconditional U.S. support for Israel could embolden Israeli officials to expand operations into Lebanon. Last week, Israel significantly escalated the situation by launching a drone strike in Beirut that killed a senior Hamas official who was involved in hostage negotiations. So this U.S. official said, listen to this quote, "I've been trying to keep an avalanche from falling on Lebanon, and so have a lot of people. The problem is no one can rein in Biden. And if Biden has a policy, he's the commander-in-chief. We have to carry it out. That's what it comes down to. Very, very, very unfortunately," end quote. And this is another example of the dissent within the Biden administration. And I know HuffPost has had a lot of sources from the unhappy officials in the State Department, as well as other departments in the U.S. government. So another U.S. official said that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, his defense minister, and his minister of strategic affairs are all, quote, "hell-bent on seizing this moment to expand the war into southern Lebanon and deliver some mythical imagined death blow to Hezbollah," end quote. So saying that they're hell-bent on this big war in Lebanon. And we've seen other reports that say U.S. officials are worried Israel's trying to provoke a war, trying to provoke Hezbollah as a pretext for a wider war. So there's also a report in Politico that quoted U.S. officials who said the administration is drawing up plans to respond to a protracted regional conflict. So they're preparing for this thing to really turn into something big. And, you know, regional conflict, they say that the war games show it could turn into war with Iran, which, again, would just be catastrophic. And Lebanon is just one area where Israel's assault on Gaza is spilling out into the region. The U.S. and its allies are threatening to strike the Houthis in Yemen over their attacks on Israel-linked commercial shipping in the Red Sea. And the U.S. is already in a low-level conflict with Shia militias in Iraq and Syria, and that could also explode. Instead of pressuring Israel to end its brutal assault on Gaza and ease tensions with Hezbollah, President Biden is opting for regional escalation as he continues to provide Israel with this full-throated support. And the official speaking to HuffPost reaffirmed that the Biden administration is not considering placing any conditions on military aid to Israel. So Iraqi Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani said on Friday that his government is beginning the process that will lead to the expulsion of foreign forces, which includes about 2,500 U.S. troops. So al-Sudani said, quote, "We are setting the date for the start of the bilateral committee to put arrangements to end the presence of the international coalition forces in Iraq permanently," end quote. So the statement came a day after a U.S. drone strike in Baghdad killed a deputy commander of the Popular Mobilization Forces, which is an umbrella group of mostly Shia militias that's part of the Iraqi government security forces. The PMF was initially formed in 2014 to fight ISIS. So al-Sudani said, quote, "The Popular Mobilization Forces represent an official presence affiliated with the state, subject to it, and an integral part of our armed forces. We condemn the attacks targeting our security forces, which go beyond the spirit and letter of the mandate that created the international coalition," end quote. The U.S. said that the drone strike was in retaliation for attacks on U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria that started in October due to President Biden's support for what Israel's doing in Gaza. The U.S. claimed the man they targeted, Mushtaq Talib al-Saidi, also known as Abu Taqwa, was involved in the attacks but provided no evidence for the claim. Apparently, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin was in the hospital and he didn't tell anybody, or the Biden administration didn't tell anybody, and they're supposed to publicly disclose these things, especially, it's the head of the Pentagon. So apparently this is kind of a scandal going on within the Biden administration. And this is a story from Politico about it. And the headline is, "The Lloyd Austin fallout is growing. Someone's head has to roll." So I'll just read some of the article here. At a White House meeting last week, Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, noticed that Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin was absent. A top Pentagon official, Sasha Baker, was there in his place. There was nothing obviously unsettling about this. Austin was scheduled to work from home, and lower-level aides often sit in for their bosses. But what neither Sullivan nor Baker knew at the moment was that Austin was already hospitalized at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center with complications from an undisclosed surgical procedure. Days later, Austin's secret hospitalization had spiraled into a drama engulfing the upper echelons of the Biden administration. Senior White House officials are struggling to answer questions about who knew what and when about the former general's medical emergency. Criticism is pouring in from Congress and the media, and since the Pentagon went public with the situation Friday night, new reports are coming in, including Politico's disclosure on Saturday evening that the Pentagon had not informed President Joe Biden or the National Security Council for days that Austin was indisposed.
You run your mouth and I run my business, brother. You tell everybody I'm busted. You talk so much you got me disgusted. But you run your mouth and I run my business, brother.
All right. Flu is intensifying, especially in the Southeast and the West. Flu's having a comeback here. It's coming out of retirement. After a few years off, it realized maybe it should get back into the winter cold game. Like, why is it that COVID and everyone else is able to, enjoy all the fun of getting people sick? Flu, it took like 3 years off. It had been around for like 100 years, getting people sick all winter, and then it just disappeared, decided, hey, COVID, you know what? You're out there, you're fucking shit up. You're a young kid. You enjoy it. This is your time. But then it realized, it's time for me to get out of retirement and show these new viruses what's up. These new viruses think they're all that shit. I've been around 100 fucking years. And so there you go. After 3 years of just deciding to take 3 winter seasons off, the flu is getting back into the game. And really the reason why they're publishing articles like this, it's a warning because many of us have gotten back into seeing our loved ones. And remember, the better strategy is to delay the things that might get you sick by staying home so that eventually you go out and you just get it anyways. But remember, don't see your loved ones during the holiday season because you might get sick sooner. And so you might as well stay home, be a reclusive individual, and then maybe sometime down the line expose yourself and get sick. But in the meantime, don't be hanging out with loved ones because you might get sick sooner. And you might as well delay it for, just because it's always better to get sick later. I think that's the strategy when it comes to engaging in life is don't engage, delay engaging in life, and then at some point you'll get sick, but at least it happened at a later point in time. It's like somehow you win by getting the flu last. There's something odd to me that I guess if you make use of your capital, either by spending it or saving it, it seems to help the economy because either you're spending your money, you're signaling what you want to purchase, and then producers can sell it to you, or you're saving it, and then it's out of circulation. But I was like, what is it about the government spending that it seems to just be like a black hole? Like you would think at least if they're spending it, so it gets spent on something, so it does something. And so I was reading this article, which I think gave a slightly better explanation for what I was going for. So I probably can't read it. All right, everyone, you go do your own homework. I did enough episode for one day. It was called "What the Fed Accomplished: Distorted the Economy, Enriched the Elites, and Crushed the Middle Class." And you know what? I can read. Let's just read a couple paragraphs. Indecisiveness to the extreme. That's what happens when you sit down in chairs. Let's consider how the Fed fatally distorted the economy by suppressing the cost of capital to less than inflation. Recall that the Fed crammed ZIRP, zero interest rate policy, down the throat of the economy from 2009 to 2020, while the official ate up 22% of the purchasing power of the dollar. Inflation was never 0%, so the cost of capital for corporations and financiers was actually negative, i.e., less than inflation. reducing the cost of capital and multiple distorting effects. A useful analogy is the critical of keystone species in maintaining healthy, diverse ecosystems. Risk and competition are the vital forces enabling a diverse ecosystem. Once the keystone predators have been eliminated, starfish, wolves, etc., species freed from risk and competition overwhelm the ecosystem and crowd out healthy diversity. These species end up destroying the ecosystem via overgrazing, destruction of forests, etc. The same dynamic enforced by the Fed has gutted the U.S. economy. Corporations and financiers with virtually unlimited access to near zero cost capital were free to buy up hundreds of smaller competitors, buy back trillions of dollars of their own shares to enrich the already rich managers and large shareholders, and leverage their assets and cash flow into empires of debt, which could be sold or taken public, reaping enormous profits unavailable to wage earners and those who did not have the opportunities to acquire assets before ZERP inflated the everything bubble. It's been estimated that the majority of the S&P 500 stock market rise from 667 in 2009 to current levels around 4,700 was solely the result of corporate buybacks that reduced the number of shares. This artificially increased the revenues and earnings per share. Buybacks were once illegal for good reason. We're not going to read the full article, but let's read a little bit more. All these trillions in near zero cost capital flowed into manipulation, speculation, and the reduction of competition, not into boosting productivity, efficiency, or innovation. So I guess the destructiveness of government spending versus everything else, I guess it's pretty simple. It's just mail investment. It sends false signals, and so it's actually corrosive versus the signals that you get from people freely engaging in exchange. The result of the Fed's ZERP is an economy stripped of diversity, an economy dominated by bloated monopolies, cartels and platforms generating low-quality, addictive goods and services, which reduce productivity on multiple fronts. It also, I guess, empowers the biggest corporations as they have access to the free money. Lowering the cost of capital to near zero also changed the incentives of corporates and banking leaders. The enormous profits flowed from developing higher quality goods and services or improving customer service. They flowed from manipulating markets with near zero cost capital, borrowing fortunes against corporate commercial real estate and distributing the gains to shareholders and managers. In other words, instead of having to go out, actually create value for customers, you're able to just engage in nonsense of, spending free money and boosting the assets because you're spending the free money, and, no one gains from that. Near zero cost capital rewarded speculators and CEOs who leverage financial plays, not those investing for long-term in America. The Fed's distortions are fatal because they strip the economy of incentives that are positive for the nation, not just corporations and the already wealthy. Lowering the cost of capital to zero also distorted the balance between labor and capital in favor of capital, as the already wealthy, i.e. those who already own collateral and cash flows, could leverage up their assets and income to borrow vast sums at near zero interest to scoop up income-producing assets.
So is the neocon disaster in Ukraine one last gasp to extend Western ideology and bloody the Russian nose?
Well, it was, yes, it was that. It was very much about it. I mean, you remember people were saying at the outset of the war, if Russia wins this war, the West is finished. We're over. It's done with. So, yes, it was thought to be an easy win, that particularly the financial sanctions, the sanctions on Russia. You remember the French finance minister was crowing at the time that this would collapse Russia within weeks or days. He said, and that the ruble would be, this was Biden's word, would be rubble, and that it would collapse, and that then it would be easy for Ukraine to have a victory, and that then the Western narrative would be sustained, reinforced. The Western narrative of being a winner would be reinforced and improved. So they stuck to this. The only problem is that trying to enforce those narratives, trying to keep to those narratives, it means either you have to turn everyone else's into a sort of Manichaean, like Putin, the figure of hate, the figure of Satan, whatever else, which has the disadvantage of two things. One, you never hear what they're saying. We don't listen anymore to anyone else because we're so intent on keeping our narratives at the forefront of everyone's thoughts that we don't listen to what Russia, what China, what Iran is saying anymore. We have no empathy. We have no ability to understand what's going on or what they're thinking because we insist on our narrative and we exclude the narrative of anyone else. It's finished. No, that's all lies.
Statistically, the Russian economy is in better shape now than before the sanctions were imposed, notwithstanding the enormous expense of the special military operation in Ukraine. Statistically, we all know that the Ukraine war is virtually over. Do the elites, do the neocons still see a glimmer of hope that they can pull this rabbit out of a hat, or do even they recognize that Ukraine is over, that it was a disaster, that the values behind it, which you've just been critically describing, no longer subsist, and it's time to focus their attention elsewhere?
Yes, they recognize. I'm certain of that now. They recognize this war is over, and what's more, they don't believe that it can be resumed. And all we're doing now, and all we're seeing, is ways of trying to create a narrative that the West has won. Again, that the West has won because Putin has failed. He didn't take Kiev. He didn't capture the whole country, and they impute that as a fact that this is what Putin was seeking. Whereas we know very clearly, and was later demonstrated, that what he was doing when the troops went near Kiev was to try and sort of push people towards a negotiation. And then the negotiation happened, if you remember, in March of last year, the previous year. And of course, Britain and America told Zelensky and Kiev, forget it, just keep the war going. So they want to, if you like, let down, find a narrative that says, we still won. But it's not going to work because Russia isn't going to play with that narrative. It's not going to negotiate the stalemate as they hope. Russia will negotiate, yes, but only one thing. They want capitulation. They expect capitulation and the removal of, if you like, the neo-Nazi elements from the regime. So it's not going to happen. But they're still scrabbling around, and they can't go on long because what they are resorting to now is simply firing long-range missiles into civil Russia, into civilian cities of Russia. And there's no. I mean, this isn't a military operation any longer. This is terrorism. And even the United States is not going to be able to go on very long with just simply firing lots of rockets into Belgorod in Russia and to killing lots of civilians going out doing their Christmas shopping. So I don't think it can last.
How dangerous is it for world stability that the munitions being fired at Russian civilians were manufactured in the United States?
Well, probably the last ones were manufactured in the Czech Republic, but it's the same thing that we're seeing in Gaza. It makes one complicit, and Gaza is shining a very clear light on the whole of the war on Ukraine. The attacks now by Ukraine are on civilians living in Russia, inside 91 Russia. I mean, nothing to do with the Ukraine, attacking civilians, causing many deaths. I mean, is unacceptable. It is a war crime. And the states that are supplying the long-range missiles for that, therefore, are complicit in a war crime against Russia. And, Ukraine is making this point very clearly. And the recent ICW action about genocide also underlines the point about criminal action against a collective population.
Yeah. And look, the timing is everything there. For people who were too young or not paying attention or were on the wrong side of it back then, in 2009, Obama, of course, was sworn in January, and then began a massive campaign by David Petraeus, John McCain, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Mullen, and Secretary of Defense Gates, along with General McChrystal as well. And the entire war party PR machine, especially led by the Center for New American Security, which was sort of the Democrats' PNAC, to push so hard. They called them the Coindinistas, pushing this counterinsurgency doctrine and the absolute necessity of Barack Obama sending 70,000 more troops. They always call it 30, but there was the 30 after he already sent 40. And so the big argument by November was the final 30. And Obama rolled over on what we know, and as I show in both of my books, what he knew could not possibly succeed. When you came out and blew the whistle it was August, right, of 2009? September?
It was September. Yeah, it was September when I resigned. It was October by the time it was in the paper.
All right. Well, still, he had a good, 35 days or more,
my letter,
and he must have known that you were right. Because we already know from other reporting what he knew and said about the whole thing. So it's easy to infer that when you came forward and he read what you had to say in the Washington Post and all of these things, that he knew you were right. There's no room for the argument that Obama disagreed with Ho. No, he just thought it would be better for my political skin if I go along with John McCain rather than fight him on this. That was what it came down to, not the right or wrong of the war, because he knew you were right.
Yeah, I'll tell another story, Scott, if you want. So John Murtha, who was the former House Democrat, who was one of the first to turn against the Iraq War, of those Democrats who had supported the war. Murtha was a Marine in Vietnam. He was very powerful in the Democratic Party and in the Democratic House caucus. He, for reasons that's another story that I could tell. He brought me in November and had me speak to the whole House caucus, the whole Democratic House caucus. So, here I am in November, very Forrest Gump-like experiences. Like, how did I get myself into this? And I'm standing there with Mirtha, along with Ike Skelton and Jessica Tuchman, and I think she was at Brookings or Carnegie at the time, who's the daughter of Barbara Tuchman, who wrote such great books as The Guns of August and things. But it was a debate, John Mirtha and myself versus Ike Skelton and Barbara Tuchman in front of the entire House Democratic caucus. And the House Democratic caucus erupted in response to what Mirtha and I were saying. This was mid-November of 2009, and stacked up 9, 10, 12 people deep behind a couple of microphones to all make their comments. And all the comments were, we can't go along with this. It was, this is what Bush did. This is what we did in Vietnam. And this goes on for 15, 20 minutes of these members of Congress.
Oh, I thought you were saying that they were browbeating you. No, they all got up to agree with you.
They all got up to agree with us. And then what happens is you see this hand shoot up out of the crowd. And it's Speaker Pelosi, and the speaker's privileged, so she gets to talk before, over everybody else, basically. And what she says is, I agree with you. Yes, this, and I'm going to paraphrase here, this is wrong. However, this is not the president's priority. The president's priority is the Affordable Care Act. It's Obamacare. And if we put him into a box, if we paint him into a corner on this, we are jeopardizing the president's agenda. We just cannot do this. We do not have the political space to do this right now. The political calculus was that, yes, this war is wrong. A lot of young American kids are going to get killed over there for no reason. We're going to make the circuit situation worse. It's going to hurt American security. But however, the president's priority is not this. So we have to put this on the back burner. And what then happens, what you see happening then, is certain members of Congress, certain members of the House caucus, Democratic caucus, are allowed to bang the drum on this, right? Because they have enough votes where it's not going to cause enough of a disruption. And I witnessed this for the next year and a half, almost 2 years, because as we get, so what happens, and Obama goes to West Point, as you were talking about, does his big escalation speech, big surge speech at West Point in December of 2009. And he also says, we're going to pull out, though. We're going to start pulling out. We're going to start winding this down in 18 months. And you can see the White House managing this among members of both the House and the Senate in terms of authorizing them, giving them the okay to now stand up against this war. As they get closer to that July 2011, we're going to start widening this war down date. More members of the Democratic Party are allowed to say, yes, this is the right thing to do. And it wasn't just the Democrats that knew this. It was the Republicans that knew this as well, and they did the same thing. So they allowed thousands of American kids to get killed and maimed, tens of thousands of Afghans to just be lost to history, killed without any recognition of who they are, a destruction of an entire country, on and on and on.
It is essentially public choice theory, right? It's a clunky name for the idea that government employees are individuals and they serve their own interests. And nobody knows what the national interest is. Maybe you and your friends at the bar know what the national interest is because you're thinking about somebody other than yourself. You don't have a direct connection to, what happens, only just you want to live in a free country at peace or something crazy like that, But when you're in charge, you have all these other things like the Affordable Care Act that dictates that you triple a war and kill a few 100,000 people. And you go, well, yeah, but political calculation on a piece of paper, something, in a way that is quite frankly psychopathic, but makes perfect political sense. You know what I mean? It is what it is. And Barack Obama made the calculation. He escalated the war. The liberals were going to forgive him.
Don't tread on us.
A lot has been written by Dr. Murray and Rothbard. If you had to recommend one thing for people to read, what would it be? And what is the lesson from this book or essay from Murray Rothbard that you'd like to communicate to as many people as we could?
I found Ron Paul during the Giuliani moment, which was in 2007. Then I got obsessed with Googling him and looking him up, and I found Tom Woods and Peter Schiff. And so I started reading all of their books and watching all of their videos and just obsessing over it. And it was probably at least a year or two till I started reading Rothbard. I just had heard Tom Woods mention Rothbard so many times as he's the guy that eventually I was like, I gotta read this Murray Rothbard guy. And I heard Tom Woods, I'm trying to remember back. I think it was that Tom Woods said to read these two essays. I can't remember if that's right. But the first two essays that I ever read, pamphlets, essays, something, the first two ones I ever read were Anatomy of the State and War, Peace, and the State. And those are the two that I recommend to start with. Because it's just to me, when I read those two, it was game over. I was really interested in this thing and had been interested in this thing for a while. But once I read those two essays, now it was there's no going back. I'm here now. And Anatomy of the State is I truly understood the nature of the state after reading that. And War, Peace in the State, I truly understood the nature of war after that. And nothing can, it's almost like one of these things that once you learn it, you can't unlearn it. And so that's what I would recommend to people. But there are other, there are other things that other people recommend more. Rothbard has like some economic, like technical writing that he's done that I've also enjoyed. I mean, I read Man, Economy, and State, and I did get a lot out of that. And I know that like economists will be like, that's the one you got to read. But man, there's some Murray Rothbard writing that just punches you in the stomach. Like you just, I remember reading his stuff. Once I started getting obsessed with him, or you start like reading the stuff, and I'd be reading it alone in my studio apartment in Brooklyn, New York, where I was living at like 3 a.m. because I'm a weird person. And I was just like doing stand-up comedy and then coming home to read Rothbard essays that I had printed out because I couldn't like afford books and shit. But I remember just like reading stuff and putting it down and almost like looking around this apartment with no one in it, like as if I was looking at someone else, but like, yo, dude, did you hear what he just said? But like the Do You Hate the State piece, egalitarianism as a revolt against nature, left, right, and the prospects for liberty, just like all of these pieces were just so powerful. So just like if you're really interested in these ideas, you read that stuff and you're just like, yo, I'm never going to look at anything the same after this.
So if you had to give the audience the bullet points for Anatomy in the State and War, Peace in the State, what would those bullet points be?
Okay, so bullet points for Anatomy of the State would be basically it's like, what is the state is the question, right? And so you'd say this, what is the state? What is the state, for the example, what is the federal government in Washington, D.C.? And he would say like, okay, well, it's not the people. It's not just like everybody is the government. The government is us. That's ridiculous. If you believe that, then you'd have to believe that 6 million Jews committed suicide in Nazi Germany, right? If they are the government, right? So clearly some people are, or that, black people enslaved themselves in the late 17, early 1800s, or I guess all 17 and early 1800s. So that's obviously not the case. The government isn't like the hills and the land. The government isn't your uncle and everyone you love. It's not America. That's not what the government is. And so what is the government? And the government is a small group of people, a concentrated group of people who have the legal authority to initiate violence against the entire population. And they're essentially a gang that completely won. And he kind of goes through that it's like, if imagine a gang moved in and tried to take over a block. Well, now imagine they were more successful and they took over a neighborhood. Well, now imagine they were more successful and they took over a country. What would it look like? The government. That's what it would look like. They are the state. And there's a lot more to that. He gets into like the role of intellectuals and the idea of the state constraining itself and all of that. But I think that's essentially the argument. And then in War, Peace in the State, basically the argument is like, okay, if someone aggressed against you, then you have a legitimate moral right to recoup that aggression or something like that. So if person A violates the rights of person B, then they have a right to go see about person A or, recoup what they did. But if person C, who had nothing to do with anything, is just their rights are violated in that process, then obviously that's completely wrong because they had nothing to do with that. And that war, by the very nature of war, it means innocent people being destroyed over something they had nothing to do with. And he breaks it down so much more brilliantly than that. But to me, that's like kind of the essence of it, that you go, there's kind of no case where it's ever justified to just destroy the lives of people who didn't do anything. So no matter what Saddam Hussein did, this isn't in the essay, but this is just me extrapolating from it. No matter what Saddam Hussein did, you have no right to just incinerate Iraqi children over that because they didn't do anything to anybody. And so that's essentially, I think, the crux of the argument.
Today, I've got a nullification movement status report. There's a bunch of legislation that's already been filed in states for the 2024 legislative session to treat gold and silver as money. We're talking about ending the Federal Reserve from the bottom up. So treating gold and silver as money rather than as a mere investment vehicle to be taxed, as they should have been doing all along. And even a growing number of states who are considering bills to reject a CBDC, central bank digital currency, and money as money. I'll get to all that in just a moment, but first I want to start with a foundation here from Lysander Spooner in his great essay on the trial by jury from 1852. And here's how Spooner put it. Discussion can do nothing to prevent the enactment or procure the repeal of unjust laws. unless it be understood that the discussion is to be followed by resistance. And Spooner really hammers home what I'm trying to get at here, and maybe he'll do better than I can do. He said, tyrants care nothing for discussions that are to end only in discussion. Discussions which do not interfere with the enforcement of their laws are but idle wind to them. So while we can post and yell and have signs that say, end the Fed until the end of time, it's not going to end the Fed unless the people and the states actually do something to interfere with the free-flowing operation of their fiat funny money system that comes out of the Federal Reserve, which never should have existed in the first place. And it's not just Spooner. Here's James Iredell, who I've cited many times. He was one of the first associate justices of the Supreme Court. And in the North Carolina ratifying convention in 1788, he put it this way. He said, the only resource against usurpation is the inherent right of the people to prevent its exercise. So ultimately, the only way to stop anything coming out of Washington, D.C. is the inherent right of the people to prevent its exercise, not going to the government in the hopes that the government is going to limit the power of itself. Congress is never going to cut off its printing press, and the Federal Reserve will never end itself. The nullification season for 2024, supporting sound money, rejecting the Federal Reserve, kind of getting in the way. These are first steps, but they can be big ones, getting in the way of the operation of the fiat money system. And first of all, I want to go to New Hampshire, because tomorrow in New Hampshire, House Bill 1674 is getting its first committee hearing. In New Hampshire, the process is very unusual in comparison to other states. Every bill gets a hearing in committee, every bill gets voted on in committee, and every bill, whether the committee approves it or not, gets voted on in the House. But really what you want to see have happen, if you're an activist living in New Hampshire, you want the committee to give the bill an ought to pass, OTP recommendation, because a lot of times there's so many bills that the House is just doing voice vote and they're voting in bulk. They're probably not really paying attention unless there's a lot of activity surrounding a piece of legislation. And if the committee says no, ought not to pass, they generally just kind of throw it away and it never goes anywhere, although there are some exceptions to that. But anyways, tomorrow in New Hampshire, a first hearing on House Bill 1674, which would make gold and silver legal tender in the state, as they always should have treated it. And here from a report by Mike Meharry, said, practically speaking, these provisions would allow New Hampshireites to use gold or silver in both physical and electronic form as money, rather than just as a mere investment vehicle, because government loves treating gold and silver. They love treating real money as an investment tool, as property that they can tax and control, because then you're not using it as money and you're having to rely on their fiat system. In effect, this would put gold and silver on the same footing, according to the government there, as Federal Reserve notes. We know that there is no equality between the two. And Mike continues, that passage into law would make New Hampshire the fifth state to recognize gold and silver as legal tender. Utah led the way in 2011 as reestablishing constitutional money, followed by Wyoming, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. Now, there's a little bit more to this legislation in New Hampshire. It would also include provisions to specifically exclude gold and silver bullion from taxation. Because if it's money, as Ron Paul said in support of a similar piece of legislation in Arizona a few years ago, we ought not to tax money. If you think of the idea, the example that Meharry often gives is, let's say you go to a store and you want to make some change and you bring them a gold back. We'll just say it's a $5 gold back. And you want to get some fiat garbage. And you make an exchange, and then they say, well, we got to charge you a 35-cent tax. This is a way that government discourages the use of gold and silver as money. Of course, the power to tax is the power to destroy. So it includes some provisions to exclude silver and gold bullion from taxation. It shall not, this is from the legislation, it shall not be characterized as personal property for taxation or regulatory purposes. The exchange of one form of legal tender for another shall not give rise to any tax liability. And the purchase or sale of any type or form of bullion shall not give rise to any tax liability whatsoever. That's an important part to get out of the way as well, because as long as government continues to tax this, people will be less likely to use it as money. And Mike says, in a nutshell, we also have that the legislation is going to establish a depository should it pass. And he says, in a nutshell, through the depository, New Hampshireites would eventually be able to deposit gold and silver and pay other people through electronic means. So they want to set up a payment system so people can actually use it as money in day-to-day transactions. Mike continues, private individuals and entities would be able to purchase goods and services using assets in the vault the same way they use cash and a debit card today. And doing so has the potential to open the market to sound money in day-to-day transactions. Mike continues, he said, by making gold and silver available for regular daily transactions by the general public, the depository has the potential for wide-reaching effect. Professor William Green, who passed away a few years ago, he said he was an expert on constitutional tender and said in a paper for the Mises Institute that when people in multiple states actually start using gold and silver instead of Federal Reserve notes, It can effectively nullify the Federal Reserve and end the federal government's monopoly on money. The only reason there is a monopoly on money is because people are still using the fiat trash. As long as people continue using the government money, the Federal Reserve money, the paper garbage, or a central bank digital currency, it's never going to go away. So this is just about giving people an option. And then as more people do this, then more people become interested. And that's what our, I do have a membership card. On our membership cards, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members, there's a Latin phrase, Concordia res parve criscunt. This comes from John Dickinson, the penman of the Revolution. It means small things grow great by concord. And we really believe in that here because the penman of the Revolution was right in 1767, and small things did grow great by concord. Every small step can lead to another if we have the fortitude and perseverance to keep pushing forward. So,
well, if I were Mike Johnson, and he looks like a nice guy, he doesn't have that nasty look that a lot of members and senators have. He looks like a nice guy. If I were Mike Johnson, I would not want this next picture to get out. And this is from Politico, put this up. It is not a good look for him. He's leaning into Chuck Schumer. Looks like he's saying, as I wrote in our RPI update yesterday, hey, want to make a deal. It's not a good look. Johnson strikes his first bipartisan deal, a $1.7 trillion funding accord. And I was working on our update for RPI last night. You sent this over, I think, when I was working on it, and the word struck out, bipartisan, and I remember everything you say about bipartisan, right?
Be leery about that.
Be leery about that.
So the speaker, like you say, he comes across as a decent person, and he's working hard at it, but of course I don't think there's going to be a tremendous success because we're not dealing with the real issue of the nature of government and what has happened to our republic. But in the Politico article, he's saying, but he called the deal with your friend Schumer, but he called the deal the most favorable budget agreement Republicans have achieved in over a decade. And I would say, well, to whom? Who's benefiting? Not the taxpayers. Noting that the bipartisan accord will allow, this is one I want you to comment on, noting that the bipartisan accord will allow GOP lawmakers to put their mark on the federal budget rather than running the government like the horrible show of Schumer and Pelosi, deals struck before Republicans claim that. Well, there's some, good desires about this, but my intuition is ain't likely to happen.
Yeah. So here's Brennan. She says, I need to move. You're in the presidential line of succession now as Speaker of the House. You receive access to the most classified information about national security. How has that changed your worldview, specifically on Ukraine, where you now say Vladimir Putin needs to be defeated? He says, I've always said Vladimir Putin needs to be defeated. I've never changed my position. And go to the next one. Brendan says, well, Marjorie Taylor Greene, she came out publicly a few days ago and said you had. She said he went from having a voting record to literally a month later going against his own voting record and being Speaker of the House. So Margaret Brennan, the journalist, is saying, well, Marjorie Taylor Greene said that you were not so keen on funding Ukraine. And he said, no. I voted against one of those tranches of Ukraine funding to send a message to the White House, not as a lack of resolve and standing for freedom. So he's saying, basically, I only voted no on that as a gimmick to show Biden rather than having changed my mind. One other last thing from the interview with Margaret Brennan I wanted to point out, and this is really interesting, reading between the lines. To me, it looks, as I read this, that whole sense of urgency of funding that $100 billion request for Ukraine and Israel, that was a farce. It was a charade. They knew all along, at least when it comes to Ukraine, that it wasn't urgent. The Republicans were just pretending to hold out. No, we're not going to give you this money. And here's what my evidence would be for that claim. If you can put this next one up. So here's Margaret Brennan. She said, so when you met with President Zelensky, did you say to him, I just don't know if I can get you the cash. I don't know if I can help you continue the war. And Speaker Johnson said, no, that's not what I said to him. I said, we stand resolved with the Ukrainian people and with your fight for freedom against Vladimir Putin, who is a ruthless dictator in my view. But what he said publicly, he said in our meeting, and then he said in national media in interviews following our meeting, is that he could get additional funding as late as February. He didn't need it in December, as the White House was intimating. So that whole struggle that we're running out of money and we need it immediately, that was a farce. And the Republicans were just pretending to hold back that money.
We have bits and pieces of the peace dividend, when the Cold War ended. But it looks like they're determined not to benefit from the peace benefit. When you think of the oil wells and the pipelines and the trade that goes on with, our arch enemy right now, well, we have several, but China is a big enemy. But now we're in a trade war with them. But China reacted to that trade war. They put some sanctions on us.
How dare they?
I don't think they have a right. They've been shooting down our airplanes, too. When they put this map up of this 100 and some attacks on America, all around Iraq and that Middle East, Easter. You look at that and you say, where in the world? I thought it was bad, but that picture, this image, just cluttered with it. And there's the other picture that, well, you know, why should the Iranians worry about intrusion? Or you look at that and you look at how many missiles and bases we have right around the border of Ukraine, Iran. Anyway, that's the way it goes. You know, in general, no matter what issue we talk about, in my mind, I go over this issue with 3 questions, and usually the answers will help me decide what we should do. And one is that when people propose something, I look at it and say, well, is this morally correct? Should we be doing this? Should we be bombing somebody or doing some other thing or some domestic thing that is done for humanitarian reasons, but it's actually going to make life worse for the people who need some help? And also the question is this constitutional? Has the Constitution authorized this process and this decision? Has it authorized us to be, you know, the empire of the world? And that's not too hard to figure out because it's just not there. But it's been around for a long time. But then the other question I asked, how practical is it? And that's where they tend to win, especially because the military-industrial complex and the special interests, you know, get their word out there and say, well, this is very practical. It's good for jobs, da da da. But most of the time, if you look at it, it's not very very practical. So I think it's very important to ask a few questions because when it comes down to it, if you want something that is very practical, you know, we should go with the principles of liberty, putting the responsibility on people and what they do and how they run their own life. Merit is a better way to reward people than by you know, having affirmative action, a DEI, and all this nonsense that works through a corporate fascist state, because that goes bankrupt. We're in the middle of it. It's going to get worse. We need more people asking questions. Is what we're doing moral? Is it constitutional? Is it even practical? And I'll bet you what, we'd have a different world.
Or take a different example, take a sonnet. Now, a definite form is required to be a sonnet. That's what makes it a sonnet. A certain number of lines, rhyme scheme, etc. But what makes this sonnet this one rather than that? Its particular content or subject matter, as we would say. Therefore, for Aristotle, matter is used in a much broader sense than physical matter. Physical matter is only one type of matter, as Aristotle uses the term. Matter means the stuffing, the filling, the ingredient, the raw material. Whether it be the physical stuff, or, for instance, the stuff of a novel, which would be the episodes, the situations, the characters, or the stuff of a word, which would be like the syllables or the letters making it up, or the stuff of a person's character, for instance, his passions, his thoughts, his tendencies, or the stuff of a concept. What is the stuff or matter of a concept? Well, a concept is a certain organization imposed on sense data. It's sense data integrated, organized in a certain way. So a concept is also simply a structure imposed on a matter. In this case, a mental structure imposed on a sensory matter. In every case, matter of whatever type will always be organized, put together, structured in some way or other, giving us a certain kind of product, owing to the kind of structure imposed on the matter, whether the product be a house, a syllogism, a novel, a concept, or whatever. So for Aristotle, the following statements all mean essentially the same thing. Everything is a particular of a certain kind. Everything is matter of a certain form. Everything is comprised of stuff, structured or organized or formed in a certain manner. Now, this is the basic concept of Aristotle's metaphysics. This form-matter, structure-stuff distinction. And a good deal of the rest of Aristotle's metaphysics consists of applying this basic distinction, which has, I should hasten to add, validity in many contexts. It consists of applying this distinction to various crucial philosophic problems, showing how, if you grasp this distinction, we can answer many hitherto unsolved dilemmas. Now, if I want to follow him through just one such dilemma, and I mean the problem of change. You remember the problem as bequeathed by Heraclitus and Parmenides. Heraclitus had said change implies a contradiction, because at the end, remember when we lit the match, it's the same thing, but it's not the same. Aristotle says, true enough, it's the same and it's not the same, but in two different respects. There are, after all, two elements making up a thing. The thing which makes it this, and the thing which makes it the kind of thing it is, that gives it its qualities. Now, when the match changes, it's the same individual match at the end. Right, that means the matter is the same, but it has new qualities at the end. True enough, that simply means the matter has taken on a new form. That matter is now different in respect of its organization, and that's why it's now black, hot, and smoky, instead of pink, cool, and non-smoky. So there is no contradiction in change. Change for Aristotle is simply the process of the same matter taking on new form. The result will be a thing which is the same and different. But that's no contradiction if you specify the two respects. Or look at the problem from the perspective of Parmenides. Parmenides said, how can there be change? What is not, for instance, is becoming what is, and vice versa. That when the seed becomes the flower, at the beginning the flower was not, and at the end it is. And vice versa, at the beginning the seed is, and at the end it's what is not. And therefore change really involves a miraculous appearance out of nothing and a miraculous disappearance into nothing, and that's hopeless. Well, Aristotle said, look, the material, the basic material has always existed. It merely changed its form. When the seed becomes the flower, nothing comes into existence or goes out of existence. It's merely a different form imposed on the same fundamental material. And therefore, Aristotle draws the conclusion, change does not involve a contradiction. A changing world, and this is his main concern, is an intelligible, understandable world. As against Plato, Parmenides, Heraclitus, he refuses to degrade this world into a semi-reality mixed with being and non-being on the grounds that change is contradictory. He says, no, this world is fully real and non-contradictory. As for the idea that change conflicts with the law of identity, he also says, in addition to the points I've made, that truth is the exact opposite. Change, he says, presupposes the law of identity. Because what do you mean by change? Change is change from something to something, from one identity to another. If there were no identity, if nothing is anything, if everything is riddled with contradictions, then you can't have change. Change of what? From what? To what? Obviously, it would be impossible. What is his ultimate conclusion? You are right that it is a changing world, he says to Plato. But change is perfectly logical and rationally understandable.
Soft landing or hard crash. A clip from the 1990 movie Home Alone, where the lead character purchases groceries, household goods, and toys, recently went viral because he paid a total of $19.83, whereas today the same purchase would cost over 3 times as much. Ironically, while this evidence of the Federal Reserve's failure to maintain the dollar's value was going viral, stocks rose because investors believe the Fed has successfully engineered a soft landing by bringing down price inflation without causing a recession and would soon begin reducing interest rates. Then, stocks fell at the beginning of the year when the release of the notes of the Federal Reserve Board's last meeting suggested the Fed would not hurry rate cuts. The likelihood of a delay in cutting rates was further increased by a positive December jobs report. The jobs report did show unemployment remaining low and wages slightly increasing, but the news was not all positive. One of the report's most troubling items is that a top source of increased wages is government. An increase in the salaries of government employees also increases government debt, which will have to be paid for by taxes. Since tax increases are unpopular, the government relies on the Federal Reserve to do the dirty work by purchasing federal debt instruments and thus creating more inflation. This inflation tax is the worst of all taxes because it is regressive and hidden. If the Fed allowed interest rates to increase to anywhere near what they would likely be in a free market, interest rate payments on the federal debt would rise to a level causing a financial crisis. Even though the federal government will soon spend more on interest on the federal debt than on the Pentagon and the military-industrial complex, few in D.C. are serious about cutting spending. Federal debt increased by $1 trillion from mid-September to the beginning of the new year. It is expected to increase by around another $1 trillion by the end of March. To put this in perspective, consider that the federal debt did not reach $1 trillion until 1981. Almost 200 years after the Constitution was ratified. Continuing increases in the federal debt and Federal Reserve-created inflation will lead to economic crisis caused by a rejection of the dollar's reserve currency status. There is already resentment over the U.S. government's use of the dollar's reserve status to support U.S. sanctions. This is why Russia and Iran recently signed a deal to trade in their own currencies rather than in dollars, and Russia is no longer accepting dollars for its oil. President Biden has kept his promise to refrain from criticizing the Fed's conduct of monetary policy. In contrast, his predecessor regularly took to Twitter to lambaste the central bank. This means the Fed will likely try to help President Biden by trying to keep interest rates low enough to not increase unemployment, yet high enough to not increase price inflation. While Donald Trump is more likely than Joe Biden to challenge the deep state and neoconservative foreign policy, the truth is neither Biden nor Trump will seek to reduce spending. Unless a critical mass of Americans demand an end to the welfare warfare state and the fiat monetary system, the soft landing sought by the Fed and the politicians will turn into a hard crash. Thanks for listening.
This is based on a report from the Washington Post that said some U.S. officials are concerned that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu might see an expanded war in Lebanon as key to his political survival. And this is because this is something I've been covering quite a bit, how polling in Israel shows, and it's not just polling, it's also the political pressure that Netanyahu is coming under. But the majority of Israelis want Netanyahu to resign once Israel's operations in Gaza are over. And that gives Netanyahu every incentive to continue the slaughter in Gaza and to expand the situation into a regional war that could draw in the U.S. And of course, the main reason why there's this political reckoning happening for him is because the October 7th attack happened, when there's all these signs that, Israel should have had enough intelligence, enough information to prevent it, or to at least fight the initial attack instead of let Hamas, and get that far into southern Israel. So what's interesting here about this report is that it says these U.S. officials think that Hezbollah and its leader Nasrallah don't want an escalation and don't want to see a wider war. And I think that's important, because if this thing does escalate and get really bad and turns into a major Israel-Lebanon war that the U.S. is supporting with military aid, and who knows how far the U.S. will intervene in that conflict. But I think if that happens, we're going to see this narrative completely go away, that it was Israel and Netanyahu looking to provoke this war. They're going to spin some new narrative about the conflict. This report also mentioned a intelligence assessment from the Pentagon's Defense Intelligence Agency that found if the situation in Lebanon does escalate, Israel would have a hard time fighting Hezbollah. The Post report reads, quote, "A new secret assessment from the DIA found that it will be difficult for the Israeli Defense Forces to succeed because its military assets and resources would be spread too thin given the conflict in Gaza," end quote. The report said the U.S. is putting pressure on Israel not to escalate the situation, but as we know, they're not using any leverage. They're not even considering cutting off aid to Israel. And forget about just the military aid. Also, all the aircraft carriers. I know one has gone back to the U.S. since, but the U.S. has deployed these, warships and extra planes and more air defense systems to the region, with the implied threat that if things do really explode, the U.S. is going to intervene on Israel's behalf, more directly. So this is where we're at. And as I covered yesterday, U.S. officials told HuffPost that they believe President Biden's policy of unconditional military aid to Israel is going to embolden Israel to expand into Lebanon, and it could lead the U.S. into a major Mideast war. So protesters calling for a ceasefire in Gaza interrupted President Biden during a speech at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, and that was the scene of the 2015 shooting committed by Dylan Roof that killed 9 people. So one protester shouted, quote, "If you really care about the lives lost here, you should honor the lives lost and call for a ceasefire in Gaza," end quote. And then others began chanting, "Ceasefire now." So as the protesters were escorted out, Biden supporters chanted 4 more years. And, there's just something about people calling for a ceasefire and then people chanting 4 more years. Like, are you saying 4 more years of war? And then President Biden said that he understood the passion of the people who interrupted his speech. Biden then claimed that he's been, quote, "quietly working with the Israeli government to get them to reduce and significantly get out of Gaza," end quote. But he continues to provide this aid for this mass slaughter of Palestinians that's happening. So there has been this increasing dissent within the Biden administration and the Democratic Party against Biden's full-throated support for the mass killing of Palestinians. And this incident at this church kind of shows that, it's actually the 3rd time in recent weeks that a Biden speech was interrupted by pro-ceasefire protesters. So this goes to show that this is something he's going to be dealing with, especially as he's going around campaigning. I think we might see stuff like this happen pretty frequently. And 17 Biden campaign staffers recently signed a letter to President Biden protesting his support for Israel's campaign. And they said that volunteers are quitting in droves over this issue. This is another one from Kyle at the Libertarian Institute. The Western plan to transfer advanced American-made fighter jets to Ukraine has hit another delay and is now expected to reach the battlefield during the second quarter of this year. Washington has said it does not expect the warplanes to alter the course of the war. However, Russia views the F-16s as a national security threat as the aircraft are capable of carrying nuclear weapons. So a Danish newspaper reported that 6 F-16s Denmark was scheduled to transfer at the start of 2024 are being delayed by at least 6 months. And it's not really clear exactly why. Some of the pilot courses they're still training. I'm not sure exactly when the training is going to be done. One Danish official said that it can stretch into 2025. I know there's also training going on in the U.S. Not sure how long, when that's going to wrap up. But Ukraine's been asking for these F-16s for a while, and it looks like it just keeps getting pushed back and pushed back. So a lot of people in Congress are very angry that Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, was hospitalized in an ICU and was out of commission for a few days. And he didn't tell Biden. The Pentagon did not tell the White House. But the White House is standing by Austin, the former Raytheon board member. So White House officials on Monday reiterated the president's support for Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, who said he did not intend to resign in the face of sharp bipartisan criticism for failing to disclose his emergency hospitalization to administration officials or Congress for several days. National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby said that there are no plans other than for Secretary Austin to stay in his job.
There is a real danger, and look at what's happening right now. There's a real danger of blowback, or as I call it, backdraft terrorism. If blowback is long-term consequences of secret foreign policies, then backdraft is when the obvious consequences of overt foreign policies blow up right in your face, which is, what we're very likely to suffer right now. And we got these cops chasing the wrong incentives, right? Instead of really protecting the American people, they're protecting their own agency and its reputation and its revenue stream and this kind of thing. And this is exactly the sort of, bad bureaucratic economics that gets people killed, just like we saw in the lead up to September 11th. And I'm just not a truther on this. I know it makes people mad, but even the official story is that the CIA and the FBI agents hated each other so much they wouldn't work together. And of course, James Bamford adds in his book, The Shadow Factory, that you can throw in the NSA too, that all these guys were interested in protecting their own turf. The American people were not even an afterthought. They're bureaucrats, these people. It's really dangerous.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, often when we talk about terrorism and the causes of terrorism, we have the kind of George W. Bush era simplicity to the rhetoric. And you often hear people like, I don't understand why they hate our freedom, right? And as if that's the reason people are attacking the United States or
yeah, you only get it kind of, other than when Ron Paul's telling the truth up there, back in 07 and through 12. Well, before that, but he got the attention in 07 with the Giuliani moment. But otherwise, you only get little glimpses of it where they talk about things, as you're saying, where Ray is essentially spinning for Israel, but then he's bringing up the potential of blowback terrorism. And then we also have, as people can read in your book and in all of your coverage of all of these takes, the informants, the FBI informants, always invoke American foreign policy. Aren't you upset about what America is doing in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, et cetera, Palestine, in order to fool these people into saying, yes, I'll commit a violent act? They never say, doesn't Islam make you hate freedom? Come on, that would never work. And they don't even try that. It's always American foreign policy that the informants use as their shtick to entrap the schmuck.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if you went to, just an average mosque in the United States today, Muslim worshipers would talk about their dissatisfaction of American foreign policy. I mean, now today more than ever, given the war in Gaza. And, so you're going to find tons of people who will describe being, angry about American foreign policy, which is their right to be. At the same time, though, of those people, you can find a very, very small subset of people who maybe they're mentally ill or they're just, they're kind of badly educated or they are incentivized by money, who will then respond to that FBI informant saying, like, we should do something about the war in Gaza, and say, yeah, we should, right? We should, I've got a bomb I can give you. And then they engage them in conversation. But, how many of these people really would have acted? They are definitely kind of exploiting anger that is justified in many cases,
right,
of American foreign policy within those communities.
Right. It's just another for the pile. And I have a kind of map of America in my head with little thumbtacks where all of these fake cases are from, like the Miami 7 and Lodi, California, and the Fort Dix pizza plot and the synagogues up in Brooklyn and the, you know what I mean? Like, it's just another one for the pile here out there, California way.
Yeah, no, it's
got the NYPD entrapping some idiot.
Right, and it's it's really like, to me it's just very counterproductive. There's also a part of me that years, I've been writing about this for over 10 years now, and there's a part of me now, like looking backwards, that thinks like, how does this ever end, right? Like, how do we finally get to the point where Congress says, okay, maybe we don't need to spend as much on counterterrorism, or maybe we should review, whether the FBI's tactics are effective. But no one really has these conversations at a level that would cause reform. And, so we're just kind of stuck in this kind of loop. And, the FBI will keep finding cases, because you can always find someone that you can kind of set up in one of these stings. And so, more recently I've started to wonder, like, how does this end? Maybe it doesn't, not anytime soon.
Well, and especially with this foreign policy, as long as they continue to build up these terrorist groups and then occasionally stab them in the back and turn against them and then flip back and forth over and over again the way that they do, and continue supporting Israel in Palestine and Lebanon and elsewhere. Look at what just happened in Iran. Presumably that was Israel or the United States that had either MEK or a bin Ladenite type group do that bombing, which could lead right to not just war in the Middle East, but terrorist attacks across Europe and the United States and God knows what. And so, I presume the worst is still headed this way. Like, if we have an FBI at all, I would like for them to pay attention to real ass bin Ladenites, please, and leave regular schmucks alone and protect this country from their sister agencies' policies and the consequences of them,
Pitching the book around over 10 years ago, there was a lot of skepticism about, is this really true? Is the FBI really doing this?
Yeah, does anybody care about this either?
Yeah. But it has been interesting to see how it's, how it's shifted. In some ways shifted in a farcical way. I mean, I think some of the kind of more right-wing propaganda about the FBI is a little out of touch with the facts, but it is pretty interesting to see that people are very open to accepting that this happens now, and open to seeing the criticism of the FBI.
Yeah, and, those of us familiar with the FBI's PATCON operation and infiltration of the Patriot movement in the 1990s, and, their informants' involvement in the Oklahoma City bombing and other things, has, some parts of the right pretty wise to this kind of deal. And I think, in fact, parts of the right getting wise to this, like you look at the absolute hoax of the Whitmer kidnapping plot there. And then I think it's incumbent upon libertarians like myself to point out that, look, they do this to leftists, to Earth First environmentalist types. They do this to Muslims. They do it to Army veterans. They do it to right-wing Trump supporting patriots. They do it for themselves at the expense of, essentially anyone with politics outside of the party system, right? You want to be some kind of radical, you're going to get investigated and maybe COINTELPRO'd and maybe entrapped and set up and divided, because that's how they do it.
I have a great piece in LouRockwell.com, which obviously is tongue-in-cheek because it's entitled "Joe Biden is actually a great peacemaker." But just looking at it, big picture, there are a lot of people in the Congress who believe that war is good for the economy. I mean, it destroys things. It raises the debt. We all know that. But which is the path to economic prosperity, war or peace? Should be an obvious answer.
Yeah. Yep. Well, of course. I mean, the broken window fallacy, I think, is embraced by most of Congress. You break something and you have to pay to fix it, then that stimulates the economy in some way. And they don't ever consider the unseen costs, which, of course, with war are both seen and unseen. I mean, we look at looking at Ukraine. I mean, the deadly loss of a whole generation of people, their environment, their society is broken. Terrible costs that we can see. And then there's the unseen cost. What could we have done with a couple $100 billion of American taxpayer funds? I mean, I'd like to see the debt paid down, but there's plenty of better things we could have done with that money, starting with keeping it in people's pockets. But
you read my mind. keeping it in the taxpayer's pocketbook. Exactly. The government, of course, would never think that way. Talk about unseen costs. The Republicans in the House, the Democrats in the Senate, the president in the White House. They're about to add $1.6 trillion to our debt. Gee, aren't you glad that the Republicans took control of the House so as to restrain spending? I mean, this Speaker, Mike Johnson, and these folks in the House on the Republican side have just agreed to virtually the same deal that Kevin McCarthy and Mrs. Pelosi agreed to, which was enough to kick Kevin McCarthy from the speakership. And of course, he since has left Congress. But do you think they understand the hidden costs of $34 trillion in debt, $1 trillion a year in debt service, interest on the debt?
Well, they're gonna feel it when it starts to eat into their so-called disposable income. But honestly, I think they are grifters. I think at heart, every member of Congress, for the most part, is a grifter, and so that person is looking out for what is good for me. And that for a congressman, that means what's good for my district, always in the short run. I mean, a grifter is not known for building anything. Grifters grift off what other people have built. And that's what our Congress is. It's filled with people like that. So their perspective is, I don't need to worry about the future cost of what I'm doing right now. I'm not going to pay it back. And I think individually, of course, they're not going to pay it back. But I also think this country is not going to pay it back. And then what happens then? Because our dollar is already a little bit vulnerable, less popular than it was, not backed by anything. We have all this debt. If they default, and I don't mean the government is put in default, but if we start defaulting in a number of different ways that they can do it, what is that going to do to our country? And certainly it makes us less secure. It makes the country more vulnerable, both internally and externally.
I happen to think that your grandchildren, I don't have any grandchildren, your grandchildren will see the federal government collapse from its own weight. It simply won't be able to pay its bills, and it won't be able to borrow money, and nobody will trust it, and no one will want to work for it. Something will replace it. Maybe it will break apart into 10 republics. Those who happen to live in Texas will probably have more freedom than those of us who have the misfortune of living in the Northeast, but we will break apart to 10 semi-autonomous republics because the government, like the dinosaurs, will die of their own weight.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely going to happen. It's going to happen, and I think I'm going to live to see it myself. And of course, my grandchildren will live through it, and it'll be a good thing. But one of the things that I am noticing, and I know many people are noticing, is that the various states, obviously Texas, but a lot of other states are looking at what their assets are, what is under their control, and they're actually starting to assert themselves a little bit, thinking more nationally at this state level. They're thinking about, could we rely on FEMA, for example? And any state that's had a disaster has not really had a good impression of the FEMA response, right?
Correct.
So many of these states, I would say out of the 50 states, probably 30 or 40, and they're not just the ones run by Republican governors. It's irrelevant to the politics. But I would say about 30 states have already experienced a number of bad relationships with the federal government. And they are thinking, the people there are thinking, and their politicians, their legislators are thinking about, how do we prevent this from happening again? And one of the big ways, of course, is do not be dependent on, don't be dependent on the federal handout, but also resist the federal government's so-called mandates and orders. Because as the federal government becomes more panicked, and we're living through that right now, our federal government is extremely panicked. That's why we have a robust surveillance state. They are insanely worried about what's going to happen, and they're going to lose their power. They see that they see the writing on the wall with that. But many of these states are pushing back against central authority in a number of different ways. And I even see it with California, even with the Marxist over there. Who's the governor?
Gavin Newsom.
Gavin Newsom,
Is Joe Biden a war criminal, Karen Kwiatkowski?
Of course. Yeah, he definitely is a war criminal, but he's not alone amongst American presidents that would qualify for that. But certainly Joe is a war criminal, I think, in terms of fostering what has happened in Ukraine. And of course, Obama started that. This is something, it's a long-term deep state elite government pursuit, which is to destroy Ukraine and turn it into a vassal state for us and maybe for Europe. That is criminal. There was no declaration of war, and yet we are at war with Russia through a proxy that we are lying to on a daily basis about its role. To me, that's criminal. Now, I don't know the law, but I imagine there are some things you can pull from that, and certainly the deaths of people. Now, when it comes to what's happening in Israel and Gaza, we are backing that up. We are funding it. We are providing the material of war, the bombs, the aircraft. There's 2 squadrons of F-35s over there. Now, they may have purchased those F-35s, most likely with our money, because part of the military aid program that we've had for 40 years. But we are as vulnerable to a legal charge of war criminality, genocide, any of these various international court terms as Israel is.
You pick one side over the other, they can find that you're a bigot. But that is not our goal. Our goal isn't to pick one and say, we know this group is perfect in everything they do, and this group started it all, and therefore they're to blame. But I think our goal has been, from the very beginning of us being organized, and as well as when we were in Congress, is to present the case for non-intervention, to present the case for a constitutional foreign policy of minding our own business instead of violating the Constitution and fighting wars.
Here is, now Blinken was there yesterday. He was talking, he met with Netanyahu, he met with their defense minister. But here's the headline: Israel to Blinken, Gazans can't return to north until hostages are released. And here's the write-up of this from Axios, if we do the next one, because this will give you the details. So here's what Blinken, he came to Israel again. I think this is his fourth visit so far. So he came to Israel But before he arrived, he said, quote, Palestinian civilians must be able to return home as soon as conditions allow, he said in Doha. They cannot and they must not be pressed to leave Gaza, he stressed. Now this after several prominent ministers in the Israeli government literally said that they should leave, and Netanyahu himself said they should be encouraged to leave Gaza. So there's a clear line here where the U.S. has one policy, which is not to ethnically cleanse Gaza, because that's a political liability to Biden, increasingly so. But Israel is saying another thing, and let's go to the next clip. This is from the same Axios article. Here's Israel's reply to what Blinken said. We're not going to allow Palestinians to go back to their homes in northern Gaza if there's no progress with the release of hostages. Well, that goes back to what you said, Dr. Paul, which is they've killed the hostage negotiators, and then they say, well, we're not getting any progress in release of who wants to be the next negotiator if you keep getting blown up. So it's a terrible situation there that's happening, and it really is it's an extraordinary to see the impotence of U.S. foreign policy, to have Blinken go over repeatedly, hat in hand, saying, could you do this? And these guys said, no. Take a hike, take a hike. And to seemingly have no sticks, only carrots. It's just, I've never seen anything like it.
Thinking, how many less lives would have happened if, we'll even start after World War II, if we always used the Constitution to go to war, and how many civilians have died, and how many military people have died over this period of time. And then again, if you take the argument of some people who are saying, well, World War I was a terrible war to usher in an age or a century of war, and that, ushered in that century where the people, just think of the war, the bombs that we have dropped. We know how many bombs dropped in World War II. Then we get to the point where there was a big date when we were involved in Vietnam. We just dropped more bombs on Vietnam than we did all of World War II.
Yeah.
So it makes no sense. And I know the majority of the people, if they had an honest choice and, and honest information, but the dilemma is, whom are you going to believe? Who will really provide the answers for us? And they are searching, but I think that eventually, the concerns does bring out the truth, and I think this is what's happening right now. The taxpayers are starting to realize a point that we've tried to make forever. You can't separate domestic economic policy from foreign adventurism. The cost of that affects the people at home, and even if you don't send the marching troops over there, if you send all these weapons and you destroy true free markets and trade policies and free trade, you're going to end up a real mess, and that's where we are today. And the only benefit coming from this is that the negative part of maintaining an empire is undermined. And I have no personal sympathies for the American empire. I don't think that's the part of America that I want to be the defender of. I want to know what liberty is all about and why and how we lost our way.
And this is Justin Amash. If we can put this next piece out. Now, we saw this on antiwar.com. It's the lead article today, so you can read it in its entirety by going there. But he put up an article about isolationism. And this is at the headline, but here's a tweet that he put in there. This has caused a big debate on Twitter X, and so he wrote a little essay about it. So we can go to the next one. Here's the operative point. He said, the way to protect U.S. forces in Iraq and elsewhere is to bring them home. Congress hasn't authorized these overseas military engagements. Previous authorizations from decades ago plainly do not apply to current circumstances. Constitutional limits exist to deter reckless wars. That sounds pretty reasonable to me.
Yes, but what's ironic is the policies that we have now condemning isolationism and those right-wingers and who knows what, will not go to war. Of course, there's the military-industrial complex and promoting all this. But the isolation, it's a canard, and that's why I was delighted that Justin put this out, because if you want to talk about isolation, and you look at the movement in the last 2 or 3, even as recent as the last 2 and 3 years, although the seeds had been sown, that our empire will end because all, world reserve currencies fade because they always abuse it, and that was destined that would happen to the dollar, and it is. So we're not surprised, but we have more isolationism. We think we're the king of the hill, so we throw our weight around, we put on tariffs, we put on blockades, we do all these things, and people keep trusting the dollar, and it's lasting for a long time, and nobody has a way of how do you transition away from it. So the very policies that we follow now are the real, truly isolationist and warmongering people, I'll tell you that. So that's the part that we have to try to realize, because it's always been annoying to me when they say you're an isolationist. That's the worst thing in the world. A matter of fact, because they've practically ruined that word. That means you don't want to talk to people, and you don't want to be free market people. You don't want to travel and share cultures and things. So, but the word I like to use, we use it all the time, is non-interventionism, and that's quite a bit different than isolating ourselves from the world, which they have just caused, and we're going to see a lot more isolation with our country on the path we're on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, for Aristotle, it's very important to examine and understand the phenomenon of change thoroughly, because that is the means, he says, of saving this world from a Platonic degradation into a semi-real, unintelligible world. Therefore, he devoted a great deal of time and attention to an analysis of the phenomenon of change, to try to carve out the conceptual categories in terms of which change would be fully intelligible. And I want to follow his analysis of change for a few minutes and introduce you to some of the further concepts that he originated to make change fully intelligible. Change, we said, is the process of matter taking on new form. Well, we can therefore use the term matter somewhat differently than I so far have indicated, and start to speak of a thing as a whole as being matter relative to a later state of development, relative to a future form it can take on. We can start to speak of a thing as a whole as being matter for some future stage. For instance, consider the bricks becoming a house. Now, just first, the bricks by themselves are matter, namely cement, organized a certain way into a brick given form. But now, regard the bricks not in themselves, but in relation to the house they are going to become. Well, if you look at them from that perspective, you can say, relative to the future house, the bricks themselves are simply matter. In themselves, of course, they're matter and form. But relative to the house, they are simply matter. They are matter of the house that is to come. Matter for the house. And the house now, when it comes, relative to the bricks, is simply form. It is the new form imposed on that matter. Or take Aristotle's favorite example of an acorn becoming an oak. Now, in itself, as abstracting away from any change, in the so-called static analysis, matter, an acorn is a combination of form and matter like everything else. Its various compounds, which are its stuff, organized a certain way to make an acorn. But now, acorns and various other chemicals in the soil combined can be reshaped, can acquire a new form, can become a tree. And so, relative to the oak tree, the acorn is simply matter. It's matter for the oak. And the oak, relative to the acorn, is simply form. It is form, the new form given to the acorn. Now you see there are these two senses, the so-called static sense, in which a thing is always matter and form, and the so-called dynamic sense, when you think of a thing as matter relative to the next form, or as form relative to the preceding matter. And to avoid confusion, Aristotle carved out a new set of terms, a new set of concepts to stand for the dynamic, changing use of this concept. The terms potentiality and actuality. Bricks, he said, we can say are matter for a house, but it's clearer to say, although it means exactly the same thing, bricks are potentially a house. And the house, when it comes, is the actuality of the bricks. In other words, it is the actualization of their potentialities, the thing which gives a new form to the bricks, the thing which contains in full reality what had earlier existed only potentially. Or the acorn, we can say, is potentially an oak. It is matter for an oak, and the oak is the fulfillment or actuality of the acorn's potentialities. Now, you're obviously enormously familiar with this because you all use the terms potential and actual. This was their actual genesis in Aristotle's metaphysics. In his sense, therefore, matter is any material which has potentialities for reorganization, any material which can become or do something else. And form is any structure in which these potentialities are actualized. So Aristotle will say, for instance, and see if you can now translate, his literal sentence will be something like, a closed eye is matter for seeing. Now, can you translate that? That means simply, a closed eye has the potentiality to see, assuming it's not blind. And when you open the eye, you then have the actuality, the form of what before you had only the matter. The thought here is actually quite simple. You have to get used to the terminology. It still survives today in an attenuated sense, Aristotle's actual usage of matter, if you utter a sentence like, he's got good stuff in him. Now, that's Aristotle's use of the term stuff, you see. He's got potentialities, you see. Or if you say he's good material for football, that use of material is Aristotle's sense. Or he's great presidential timber. That use of timber is actually the literal original Greek sense, because the original Greek word hule, which Aristotle uses for matter, in the time before Aristotle meant actually timber. All of those are our ways simply of saying he has potentialities, you see. And when he, sometimes we say when he actualizes his potentialities, well, he's really in form today. And you see, that's the Aristotelian form equals actuality. So if we use the potentiality-actuality terminology, we can say change for Aristotle is the passage from potentiality to actuality. And so we have another way of putting the answer to Parmenides. Parmenides said when the seed becomes the flower, we have nothing becoming something, namely the non-flower becoming the flower. Aristotle says this is wrong. You don't have nothing becoming something. You have one kind of reality, potential reality, namely the flower at the start, becoming another kind of reality, actual reality, the flower at the end. Change is the passage, therefore, from one form of being to another, from potential to actual. All of it taking place within the confines of reality and what is, at no point depending upon what is not.
So Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant told Secretary of State Antony Blinken on Tuesday that Israel's attack on the southern Gaza Strip city of Khan Yunis is intensifying. One purpose of Blinken's visit was to push Israeli officials to reduce the intensity of the onslaught in Gaza. Now, Israel has said they're scaling down operations in the north, but focusing on central and southern portions of the Strip, where most of Gaza's Palestinian population is located. And for the people on the ground, there's no relief because of this kind of change in operations in the north. So Gallant briefed Blinken on what they called the change in combat tactics in the north and, quote, emphasized that operations in the region of Khan Yunis will intensify and continue until Hamas leadership is detected and Israeli hostages return home safely, end quote. Israeli officials have publicly rebuffed concerns from the Biden administration since October 7th. These past 3 months, it's been over 3 months now. You know, when Jake Sullivan went over there, one thing that he said he was going to work on was to get a timeline to see how long this was going to last. They wanted them to wrap it up in a few weeks or a few months. And Gallant on TV was standing there and told Sullivan, we need a lot of time, And now you have the IDF saying this thing's going to go on for all of 2024. And now Gallant telling Blinken, we're going to actually ramp things up. So there was later a report from Axios that said the only tangible thing that Blinken achieved while he was in Israel was an agreement from Israel to allow UN officials to visit North Gaza to evaluate conditions for a future return of the around 1 million Palestinians who were forced to leave the area, forced to leave their homes. Most of their homes have been destroyed. So that's the one thing Israel apparently said they would do, is let some UN people go check out North Gaza. We'll see if that actually happens. But Israeli officials are still saying that Palestinians cannot return to the north until a new hostage deal is reached. And Israel just killed one of Hamas's negotiators, so that makes that prospect pretty unlikely. So Israeli airstrikes continue to pound Gaza while Blinken was in Israel. And according to Gaza's health ministry, 126 Palestinians were killed in the Strip on Tuesday. Just on Tuesday alone, 126 killed. So the death toll now is over 23,000, including over 9,000 children. That's how many people have been killed in this U.S.-backed Israeli slaughter. The Pentagon said on Monday that it has no plans to withdraw from Iraq, despite Iraqi Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani saying that he's taking steps to expel the U.S.-led international coalition that's based in the country. Brigadier General Pat Ryder, he is the Pentagon spokesman, he said, quote, "Right now, I'm not aware of any plans to plan for withdrawal. We continue to remain focused on the defeat ISIS mission," end quote. And he said there's been no notifications from the Iraqi government to the Pentagon to leave. Al-Sudani made the comments about moving toward a withdrawal on Friday after the U.S. launched a drone strike in Baghdad that killed a deputy commander of the Popular Mobilization Forces, which is an umbrella group of mainly Shia militias that's part of Iraq's security forces. And his government has really strongly condemned all the U.S. airstrikes that have been launched in Iraq since October 7th as in retaliation for the attacks on U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria. And there's still been a lot of those. That's another thing, those bases keep coming under rocket attack. So I saw there was a Politico report on Tuesday that said al-Sudani has privately expressed to the U.S. that he's interested in negotiating a continued U.S. military presence, and that his statement on ending it was just an attempt to satisfy domestic political audiences. So apparently, in this Politico report, says that they obtained a State Department cable that said this, and that says that Sudani himself remains committed to negotiating the coalition's future presence in Iraq. I mean, his rhetoric was pretty strong about, denouncing, calling the U.S. airstrike a terrorist attack. I think this goes to show how the U.S. does have Iraq basically held hostage, because they have all this control over their money supply, over their economy in general, and they can really do tighten the screws if they want. And the U.S. says this is about ISIS. That's why they're still there. But it's not about ISIS. It's about Iran. It's about staying in Iraq and Syria, to push back against Iran's influence and presence in those countries. And of course, Syria is also about the economic campaign against Damascus, against Syria, and all the oil fields are there. There's lots of resources in the part of eastern Syria that the U.S. controls. But this political report also said that there is a chance that it's possible the political machinations inside the Iraqi parliament force al-Sudani to take steps to remove American forces anyway. And, it is something. It's basically saying the Iraqi parliament wants the U.S. to go. It's supposed to be a representative government. And if they want the U.S. to go, why is the U.S. still there? In 2020, the Iraqi parliament voted unanimously to expel the U.S., but they didn't leave. And how were they able to stay, even though there's all this opposition in the country? I think it's the control, the economic leverage and influence. So Ukraine's air defenses are being depleted by Russia's intensified missile and drone attacks as Western military aid for Ukraine is drying up. Ukrainian Air Force spokesman Yuri Innat said, quote, "Intense Russian air attacks force us to use a corresponding amount of air defense means. That's why we need more of them as Russia keeps increasing its air attack capabilities," end quote. The problem for Ukraine is that its war effort is entirely reliant on Western support, and the U.S. is its biggest benefactor. And the U.S. has said that it does not have the money to send Ukraine more weapons until Congress authorizes more aid.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
We had forecast that World War III began on February 22nd, 2022, when the Ukraine war began. Our cover read from COVID war to Ukraine war to World War. And now it's right in front of everybody's eyes. There's your cover. But everyone's too blind to see. Why don't you go on to the Cartoon News Network? See what the major story is. Takeaways from the appeals court hearing on Donald Trump's immunity claims. What the fuck does that have to do with trend forecasting and how it's going to help me prepare, prevail, and prosper? And does Taylor Swift like to take it up the, no, wait. Yeah, just crap like that. Not one word, not one thing on their front page about the Ukraine war or the Israel war. Hey, let's go to Drudge. Boom, big, right across the top. Violent political threats surge as 24 begins. Violent political surge. Hey, what's going on in the economy? Oh, no. Well, forget about that. What's going on with the Ukraine war and Israel? No, we're not going to talk about that. Not one word in that whole Drudge report. Why don't you go to Yahoo? Oh, Yahoo has the best story yet. Mississippi governor in second inauguration says he wants young people to stop leaving the state. This guy got more chins than Chinatown. You should see this guy. What the fuck do I care about this? Not one word. Not one word. You look through all of the top ones, nothing about the Ukraine war and the Israel war that are ramping up. Your details are all in your Trends Journal. One after another coming out of Israel. Oh, they just killed another 3 guys in Lebanon. Oh, what happened with that ceremony they had for Soleimani? Yeah, the guy that Trump killed, the general, Iranian general he killed him in Iraq in 2020. And almost 100 people died. And they're blaming it on ISIS says they did it, and Iran said Israel did it. Oh, and then the Iranian commander that was killed a couple of weeks ago in Syria, allegedly by Israel. Oh, and now Ukraine bombs away over there more and more in Russia. As we had warned, they're going to ramp up this war. They're both going to ramp up this war. We have maniacs in charge. But we're not going to talk about that. We're not going to talk about that at all. Now, it's not the news. It's just like the American government has nothing to do with what the founding fathers founded it upon. We got a bunch of warmongering little fucking shitheads that love war that never fight. But anyway, let's go back to your Trends Journal because a lot going on. We've been warning about the office building bust. And now one of our top trends this year is banks go bust. You ready for some of the headlines coming out? I'm just going to read you a couple of quick headlines from Financial Times. pile up of badly performing loans set to leave dent on U.S. bank earnings. Leave dent. Who the fuck are you talking to? This is just the beginning. Oh, big story in the Wall Street Journal today about Moody's. Yeah, the office vacancy rate with a V, vacant, empty fucking buildings at nearly 20% vacant. Same thing up there in Toronto. Yeah. It's around the world. The scumbags that launched the COVID war, we warned about this. The work at home trend became real. Yeah, work at home 2 or 3 days a week. Come back a couple of days a week. I don't need all this office space. I'm cutting my rental costs. The banking bust has just begun, and they're not even talking about it yet. This is the language that they're using. Pile up a bit. Yeah. What else? Bankruptcies in U.S. healthcare hit record levels. It's only in healthcare. Don't worry about it. U.S. venture capital funding drops 60%. Economic fears, and new. How about today? The World Bank came out and warned that we're going to have a terrible 2024 global GDP numbers. They're looking like 2.4%. And 56 million Americans have been in credit card debt for at least a year. That's according to the Federal Reserve. Washington, South Africa's filing a genocide case against Israel. And that clown Kirby, they look like this, little arrogant jerks. They're all arrogant pieces of shit, these government spokesmen. Washington opposes it. They're slaughtering people. Here. This is the toilet paper record, right? Look at that. Russian strike kills 11, Ukraine says. Yesterday, nearly 450 Palestinians were killed by Israel. That doesn't make it. No, we don't write any of that. We're prostitutes. They're selling because that's who they are.
You run your mouth and I run my business, brother. You tell everybody I'm busted. You talk so much you got me disgusted. But you run your mouth and I run my business, brother.
Oh yeah, we had talking about you got to take the lie to the extreme.
Soul.
Is you had this video that was making
I'm
rounds.
try to get through this. Thank you for what you did 3 years ago today. Please tell.
Even the guy who was there with the tats is like, oh shit, are you really gonna cry right now? Do I have to play along for this? Dude, the people on the news, they deserve some Oscars. Biggest bullshitter in media should be a new category at the Oscars. Best fake cry, most overselling of a dramatic event that wasn't a dramatic event. I mean, these people, they scared everyone into staying home over COVID, and now they're crying as if January 6th was the day that we nearly lost the country. Where is the Oscars for the biggest bullshitter in media? All right, I think this is the last story for today, but we had Fauci, I think 16 hours of closed-door testimonies. I said beforehand, it's going to be an entire day. I don't recall. I don't remember that. I don't recall. What was that? What? No. Someone said in an email? I don't even write emails. Can I see it? I don't recall that. I don't know that either. Someone said that. Who would say that? Blah, blah, blah. But anyways, apparently, he spent the whole day saying, I don't recall this. Firstly, I don't like the closed door testimonies because you need a big rehearsal. Both sides got to try and figure out what their damning moments are and try and channel to the guy, what you're going to come after him for the next day. Let's just do this shit in front of the cameras. Let's get it out in the open. And then I think it was Zero Hedge. I think over 100 times he was, I don't remember. I said that. I don't know what gain of function. Who would fund the gain of function? We were blah, 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 blah. But finally, years after this guy was the world's biggest expert, the lack of character and the complete 180 in personalities of from 1 minute being, you can't even try, you can't, why, how dare you question me? I am the science. How dare you question me? Because apparently you can't remember anything. Apparently you're the world's biggest dumbass that there's literally nothing that you can remember. You have no idea how decisions were made. It's quite the 180. How do we speed this shit up? This got cut out of my end of year thing, but I thought it was an incredible, and this is just so government, was I covered that story about the energy secretary who was out there and they couldn't even plan their propaganda properly, that they're out there and they can't charge their electric vehicles. They got some baby or kid in a car on a hot day waiting to fill up and they're blocking the charging stations. And you know what she said afterwards by way of apology is that we exerted bad judgment. Isn't your entire thing that you guys have better judgment than the rest of us? Isn't that the pitch for your job? Is that you're better at exerting good judgment? And then you just get to turn around after, oh, yeah, it was bad. I'm dumb. Well, then why are you in charge? Are you going to step down from your post? Are you finally come to the realization that you're actually not better at exerting judgment than the rest of us? And so maybe there shouldn't be centralized authority where you're specifically appointed to make judgments that the rest of us couldn't? Maybe there's a different way to do it. Maybe there's all of us just make our little decisions based daily on what we prefer, and the hive mind can make better decisions for us than you, who just openly admitted that you're actually not good at making judgment calls. How do you just turn around in government, keep your job, and go, yeah, it was a bad judgment call? Your whole pitch is that you're better at making these calls than the rest of us. Or in this case, you were the god of science. Where's the god of science now when you can't remember anything? So this was from the New York Post, and I appreciated this one. But amidst all the things that Fauci couldn't recall, this one he could recall, that apparently when they were telling us about the 6 feet of separation, there was no science behind that. At some point, someone just wrote it in, and they're like, all right, I guess we're going with that too. It's like when you turn around and you're at a presentation pitch and there was something that got scrapped and someone else just starts saying it, you're like, oh, all right, I guess we're including that here too. Here, this is from the New York Post. Dr. Anthony Fauci confessed to lawmakers Tuesday that guidelines to keep 6 feet of separation ostensibly to limit the spread of COVID-19 sort of just appeared without scientific input. Fauci 83 revealed to the House Select Subcommittees on the coronavirus pandemic that the 6 feet apart recommendation championed by him and other U.S. public health officials was likely not based on scientific data. There you go. I mean, this is the expert. The god of all science can tell you, doesn't even know that it wasn't based on scientific data. He doesn't even know whether or not it was or wasn't made up because, he is the expert, but that could have been a scientific recommendation or it could have just been made up. But remember, whoever's now in his post, that's the new god of science. So you got to listen to the guy. It's once you leave. It's something about when you hold the position. It's like the ring of power that you can disappear. If you hold the position of power, you magically are able to have clarity. It's like a thing from God that since we've chosen you to hold the seat of power, God allows you to have a mental clarity that the common man can't have. And so while you're in that position that no one in, the general public appointed you to, and I guess we appointed the politicians who appointed you. I don't know. Whatever. I'm just saying. The logic here is that once you're in the position of power, you have a clarity that no other man can fathom. But what happens is once you leave that position of power, you lose it. You lose that gift. It was like when Thor had that hammer staff and then lost his hammer staff. I didn't really pay attention to those movies, but you lose it. And then you turn around. I don't remember. Did I say that? I don't recall. Maybe that was science. Maybe we just made it up. But, we kept pushing it and, maybe I don't even know. Here we go. Fauci 83 revealed to the House Select Subcommittee on the coronavirus pandemic that the 6 feet apart recommendation championed by him and other U.S. public health officials was likely not based on scientific data, according to who is also a physician. This was the same thing Mueller did, man. It's hundreds of millions of dollars or $20 million, whatever it was. Hey, this is the expert. This is the guy that can unwind the whole thing. This is the guy that can get after it until you pull him in to ask him about what he was doing. And all of a sudden, they've all been hit on the head. Suddenly, everyone gets onset dementia when they got to show up in front of Congress, and it's either that's part of an ongoing investigation or I don't remember.
Don't tread on us.
Welcome to Keith and I Don't Tread on Anyone in the Libertarian Institute. This is a section from my book, Domestic Imperialism, 9 Reasons I Left Progressivism. I always admired progressives' unapologetic opposition to unjust ideas. Progressives could correctly identify unjust ways of operating society. But today, whether it's colonialism, racism, sexism, classism, xenophobia, or the military-industrial complex, progressives have embraced all of those vicious ideas and have made them the center of their campaigns. They explicitly embrace colonialism by supporting the federal government's centralization of control. They judge people by race, gender, and class. They negatively generalize stupid Americans and evil Russian interferers at every opportunity, and wish for the state to have more money and power, knowing that a large portion of that money and power will be directed to military-industrial interests, leading to the mass murder of innocent human beings. Progressivism survives by only looking at one side of the equation when it comes to social and economic issues. They see the large amounts of revenue that organizations like Amazon have and conclude that Amazon must be vilified. They seldom, if ever, ask, why do so many people voluntarily choose to spend their scarce money in exchange for so many Amazon products? How many people with lower incomes have had greater access to products as a result of Amazon services? Thanks to Amazon, how many more options does the average person have to choose from just by scrolling on his phone or computer? How many authors and small businesses are empowered by Amazon Marketplace instead of having to go through a major publishing house or having to open up their own warehouse? It's common to see progressives who offer me no job, no products, and no services claim that my real enemies are people who voluntarily offer me those things. Like a jealous spouse, they become abusive when they feel insecure. Rather, then do the work that it takes to improve themselves. It's noteworthy that Amazon has voluntarily chosen to enact a $15 an hour minimum wage, the very thing progressives say can only be achieved by a state coercion. Zero-sum thinking is defined as situations in which one person's gain would be another's loss. If progressives could clearly differentiate between mutually beneficial exchanges and coercive, parasitic transactions, they would cease to be progressives. Unable to move beyond zero-sum thinking, progressives will abandon any sense of gratitude for the society around them, making it highly improbable that they will be able to test theories empirically about what makes societies thrive and which policies or institutions lead to the impoverishment of society. Progressives should appreciate that genius comes in many different forms. Socrates, Leonardo DiCaprio, Dave Chappelle, Michelangelo, and Nikola Tesla were all geniuses. Genius also comes in the form of ideas regarding how to innovate and produce things which people want, and to do so in an affordable way so that the products can be accessible to the masses. Progressives making enemies of the great voluntary innovators in society is not just unnecessarily divisive, it stops the rest of us from having access to the fruits of those innovators' talents. Looking at the monarchical systems of the past, many intellectuals incorrectly blame the shortcomings of said monarchies on the elitist, arbitrary characteristics of the kings and queens who flaunted their royalty while others lived in poverty. The problem with monarchy is not elitism or some people having a huge sway in society. As the iron law of oligarchy teaches us, anytime people organize, a very small portion of them will have most of the power and influence. The problem with monarchy lies in the fact that one organization, the state, has an exemption from morality by having a monopoly on violence within a geographical area. The government has a recognized right to perform actions, impose taxes, regulations, and declare wars that would clearly be seen as criminal if any other organization engaged in them. Imagine the Catholic Church, or any person or group of people, doing what the state does every day. Everyone who doesn't give the Catholic Church 25% of his annual income every year will be put in jail. If he resists the Jesuit officer, the officer has a right to shoot him. Everyone by law must contribute to the Catholic Church school fund, and if parents don't send their kids there, they will be jailed for truancy law violation. Most people need a license by force of law from the Catholic Church in order to work. This way the church can keep you and other customers safe. All humans have a 9-digit Catholic security number, so the church knows who's who. If the Catholic Church decides to wage war on the Church of Scientology, everyone must be forced to fund the war, and men ages 18 to 45 will be conscripted to perform forced labor against their will. The problem with this situation is not that we don't get to vote on who the Pope is once every 4 years, or that the votes need accurate counting. It's that some people claim an exemption from common sense morality by engaging in non-consensual activity. The solution is to decriminalize all capitalist acts between consenting adults and cease to have moral double standards for elites and laymen. True empowerment of the economically vulnerable comes from economic freedom, not from getting to choose which politician gets your one vote every few years. In short, privatize everything. Incentives of profit and loss allow you to harmonize individual self-interest with collective well-being. The free market approach is the only morally justified system, since it relies on voluntarism while recognizing the right of self-defense.
Talking about the first law of nature. The right of self-defense is the first law of nature. In most governments, it has been the study of rulers to confine this right within the narrowest limits possible. We certainly see that playing out before our very eyes today as well. But he goes on. Wherever standing armies are kept up, and the right of the people to keep and bear arms, under any color or pretext whatsoever prohibited, liberty, if not already annihilated, is on the brink of destruction. So it's this 1-2 punch. 1-2 punch of a natural right of self-defense where the people have to be able to defend themselves and a standing army. So if they take away the right to keep and bear arms or they attack it, you still have the right, even if government violates it. It's just a matter of whether or not the people stand up for it or not. But ultimately, if you have that combination, you are going to have absolutely destroyed liberty. That is a very good description of what we live under today. Now, anytime we share anything about the need for a militia as a defense against domestic tyranny, whether it's to fight off domestic tyranny, or in this case, on this episode, I'm going to be talking about how it was there to prevent even the need for having a large permanent standing army in times of peace. We get some really arrogant, angry, but ignorant people telling us how this is just dumb. We don't know what the hell we're talking about. For example, over on X, just this week, we saw this guy post, I don't know, whatever, Good grief, you patriots, and patriots, of course, is in quotes, are so ignorant of your own country that it's plain sickening. They encourage militias to stand up to the British. They want us to know that the only reason to have a militia system is to defend against foreign threats. And because the implication there is a militia system can't, in a modern system, deal with that as effectively. Now, many of the founders actually recognized that a militia system was just the first line of defense, and then you could organize the army as a backup and to take over and be in charge. That's what their experience was in the Revolutionary War as well, the War for Independence. But the implication here is that you can't support the militia system. It's unnecessary in modern times. So the right to keep and bear arms is not needed. It can just be confined to the National Guard, for example. And that's kind of this whole train of thought. Now, this is a total lie because they're missing a big point of the militia system. It is not just to fight off domestic tyrants, but to prevent them from having the excuse to having this bane of liberty, large standing armies. Here's how James Madison put it in the Philadelphia Convention. As the greatest danger to liberty is from large standing armies, it is best to prevent them by an effectual provision for a good militia. This isn't some Berkeley hippy-dippy gun grabber from here in California. This is James freaking Madison, the father of the Constitution, telling us that the greatest danger to liberty is from large standing armies. So how do you do that? How do you get rid of that danger? Well, you can't totally eliminate it, but you prevent the need to have them at all times by a strong, powerful, armed population, a good militia. George Mason was fully on board with this message as well. He said he hoped there would be no standing army in time of peace, unless it might be for a few garrisons. That's very similar to what George Washington recommended in 1783 as well. So George Mason hoped there would be no standing army in time of peace, none, unless it might be for a few garrisons. The militia ought, therefore, to be the more effectually prepared for the public defense. So here he is pointing out, we don't want a standing army, but we have to have defense. And the best way to do that are the people themselves, the first line of defense. A little bit more from George Mason, just to kind of show you the vehement opposition from so many in the founding generation against the notion of a permanent military establishment. And Mason put it this way in Virginia: I abominate and detest the idea of a government where there is a standing army. Now, a standing army is not an army that is in the middle of fighting a war, especially a declared war, or when you're under attack. It is it's an empire. It's what they actually wanted to get away from. Of course, they lived the experience of a large permanent standing army starting in 1763. After the 7 Years' War, the French Indian War, whatever you want to call it, the British started stationing troops, and they saw the bad examples of how that played out, whether it was the massacre in Boston or so many other things. I hear during the ratification debates, General Samuel Thompson in Massachusetts put it this way: Congress will have the power. He was concerned about consolidated power, as so many anti-federalists were. He said, Congress will have power to keep standing armies. The great Mr. Pitt says, standing armies are dangerous, so keep your militia in order. Again, the reason for so many people that don't even grasp the idea that the reason that you want an armed populace is not just to shoot deer. It's not just to protect against home invasion. It's not for sports shows. It's not for target shooting. It's not even just to fight off foreign enemies or domestic tyrants in state capitals or in Washington, D.C., or at the time, Philadelphia. It's to logistically reduce the need for having a standing army. And that's what Thompson is pointing out here, citing the great Mr. Pitt, as he put it. Standing armies are dangerous, so keep your militia in order. We don't want standing armies. On the other end of the spectrum, so we've got anti-federalists, but then we also have the arch-nationalist, the arch-big government guy, federalist, Alexander Hamilton, in Federalist Paper number 29. Not as aggressive about this statement, but certainly taking the same position, recognizing the danger or acknowledging that many people recognize the danger. I'm not really sure what Hamilton ever meant when he said stuff, but here's how he put it. If standing armies are dangerous to liberty, an efficacious power over the militia, in the body to whose care the protection of the state is committed, ought as far as possible to take away the inducement and the pretext to such unfriendly institutions. Now, Hamilton was a really smart dude, so I think he was using his words carefully here. I think he's acknowledging that most of the people see standing armies as dangerous to liberty, but he's not actually saying it himself, even though some people just might read that because we have confirmation bias. I can get more into Hamilton's views on other episodes, of course, but he's basically saying, again, reduce the inducement to people in power to actually having this tool of power. Reduce the inducement and the pretext. He said, to render an army unnecessary will be a more certain method of preventing its existence than 1,000 prohibitions on paper. Also recognizing an important maxim that words on paper don't enforce themselves. People with power, especially as Hamilton himself proved right out of the gate, 1791, of course, with his national bank. People with power will always try to expand their power as soon as they have an opportunity. Words on paper, parchments don't stop government.
Gerald Salenti is with us, and he has a magazine that talks about trends. He likes to talk not only about what has happened to our country, what's going on, but what you might anticipate. Gerald, welcome to our program today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's a true honor to be on with both of you. So thank you so much.
Let's move over to the presidential campaign. It's a fascinating thing to watch. My colleague at the Ron Paul Institute, Adam Dick, wrote a piece for us the other day saying we're facing the prospect of having the two main contenders for the president never having debated at all, either each other, which is probably going to be the case, or any of their challengers. Is this the weirdest election season or what, and what do you make of it?
It is the weirdest election season, and what's very important about it is they only report mostly the polls that Trump could beat Biden. They don't look at the polls that the people don't want either one of them. Look at the freak show that we have. We call it a presidential reality show. That's all it is. It's made for TV. The people don't like either of them. And what is so disturbing to me, that we've had these two-party gang, again, I call them a crime syndicate, because by their deeds you shall know them. They're murderers and thieves. How many more wars do they have to start and kill and steal our money? How much more of our tax money do they have to give to the bigs and to their friends, and again, the bailouts? Same gang has been running this show forever. And so there's no freedom in this. This is the end, as I see it, of the end of America. It's the beginning of the very end, because, again, all things are connected. You look at how the EU went, the UK went down. It was all their wars. And after World War I, the pound went bust and the dollar came up. Now it's America's been fighting all those wars, and now you're going to see the dollar, again, all things are connected. The dollar is going to go down as they lower interest rates. This isn't rocket science. The dollar is only strong because of high interest rates. When the interest rates go down, it's going to begin the beginning of the death of the dollar. When the dollar dies, you're going to see America die with it. So we have become the country that our founding fathers hated and fought against, Great Britain. We became that. Because in the same aspect, they have His Majesty's government. What His Majesty? The guy doesn't pee or poo. His Majesty. We got the same thing. Every time these clowns go out, the president, roll out the red carpet. And what's the matter? We got to walk on a red carpet. Everybody's saluting him. And we'll tell you what to do. Your freedom is gone. America's going down when the dollar dies. And you're going to see the dollar die, again, connected. Look, how many more countries just joined the BRICS? 5 more?
You know, you used a term that caught my attention. You talked about the government and referred to them as a crime syndicate. And that's pretty good. But you have to realize that's made our job easy because, you know, for most of us, sorting out the truth from the lying is a job. But the job has been made easy because now if anything is said or related to any report, whether even the weather reports now are all biased, you know, in one direction. But so we can assume that they're telling a lie. And that seems to be unfair. But I think it's more accurate than saying, well, you know, in a free country and most people are honest, therefore we're going to hear the truth from the government. I think we hear the truth from the people we trust, and there's still a lot of people like that, but not the people that weasel their way into government, because then when they speak for the government, we can see the results of what's going on right now. But you know, I think this whole lying business is a big deal because they get to the point, and I like to use the word nihilistic and nihilism, because it's like a religion. They don't even seek, nor do they believe it exists. And, you know, they don't have to worry about it. And I can remember as a kid that I couldn't understand communism. And they said, well, they don't believe, they believe the party determines the truth. And that helped me guide me along because we live in an age now where the people sort of go along with this, but I still think there's a remnant out there that you try to stir up at times. And I think that's the only thing that we can do, at least make an effort to expose, you know, the syndicate on what they're and how they're treating us.
Look, we talk about what I call the presidential reality show. By the way, we own that trademark. You're the last person that I voted for president. I'm serious. I wouldn't vote. And how could people be so stupid to say they vote for a lesser of two evils? Evil is evil. There's no such thing as a lesser. That's like saying almost pregnant. You know, but that shows you how bad the situation is. That we don't have alternatives to choose from. And again, you talked about the media. I used to be on everybody. I used to be on Oprah, the Today Show, Good Morning, everybody all the time. There's no journalism left anymore. Again, don't believe me. Look at what we write about in the magazine. All the bigs took over all of the newspapers. You remember every time he got caught with his pants down, Bill Clinton bombs away over Baghdad, the guy that gave us the 1996 Federal Communications Act. that let the bigs take over everything? So what do you have now? They fired over almost 3,000 journalists, quote journalists, last year. You're looking at 2.5 local newspapers closing every week.
Wow.
There is no news anymore. Again, I call the people that they call, in news, I call them prostitutes. Media whores that get paid to put out by their corporate pimps and government whoremasters. And that's all they are. There's no freedom. How many people are on any of these shows speaking about peace? How many? How many? Instead, they put that clown, that Lindsey Graham, on over and over and over and over, and all he does is promote war.
If there is a remnant, philosophic, religious, or whatever you want to call it, of people who believe in telling the truth, it's not that complicated. All we have to have is find the people who tell the truth. People will finally get fed up. And our job, and I think, Gerald, you're doing a great job, is alerting the people why you really ought to wake up. And there is something you can do. You can, anything from taking care of you and your family, but you have to try to change people's attitudes and ideas. And I think that's the most important, because I think what we have is a reflection of the deterioration of ideas led by the globalists and the progressives that despised a country that emphasized liberty at one time. I also think that one of my personal rules is when you're dealing with these very serious ideas that we should have as much enjoyment as possible. So we really enjoy having you on our program.
Well, first of all, thank you so much. I admire you so much. There's no man alive that I look up to more than you, and for all you've done and the fight that you've had for the true meaning of the American spirit. And I believe it could change, of course, because not my words, but it's by a cat by the name of Samuel Adams. It does not take a majority to prevail, but rather an irate, tireless minority, keen on setting brush fires of freedom in the minds of men.
Now let's go on. Observe that everything that is matter relative to a later stage of development is form relative to an earlier stage. Everything, or let's be very precise, almost everything, we'll see some exceptions next week, but leaving aside the exceptions, everything is the form of some preceding matter, in other words, the actualization of earlier potentialities, and at the same time it is matter for a future form. It is potentialities for a yet future actualization. The universe consists of entities constantly realizing their potentialities, passing from matter to form, which is in turn matter for a future form, and so on. And you get whole chains, therefore, whole hierarchies, where each step is successively more formed than the one before. Start with grass, for instance. Now, grass comes from something. Some potentiality made it possible, namely, let us say, a seed. Grass seed. So grass seed would be the matter, the potentiality, of which grass is the actuality. But now, in relation to what's coming, grass is also potentiality. For instance, it can be eaten by a cow and turn into beef. And so we say grass is form in relation to the seed, but matter in relation to the cow, part of which it can become. And then, of course, the beef of that cow can be incorporated by us and become human flesh, so that goes on, you see. Or the oak is actuality in relation to the acorn, potentiality in relation to timber. The timber is actuality in relation to the potentialities of the oak, which could be split and so on. And in relation to the ships that you'll build out of the timber is potentiality. Or take a concept. That's the actuality or the potentialities of the sense data. And in turn, once you have concepts, you have the potentiality for a new organization, namely combining several concepts together into a premise or a proposition, which is the actuality of the potentialities of a concept. And in turn, a proposition is the potentiality of being combined in a new organization with other principles to make a whole argument, which in turn is the potentiality of a whole science, etc. Now, what is the significance of these chains? It is the actual metaphysical foundation for the view that reality is lawful and orderly. Because what a thing is matter for depends on its nature, on what it is actually. You can make a ship out of timber, but not out of acorns. Man can live on beef, but not on grass seeds. You can make a science out of syllogisms, but not out of sheer unorganized sense data. In other words, within certain limits, the order of these cycles of actualization is necessary. It is not true that anything is possible. Now note the word possible. That's here the concept potentiality. And as the father of potentiality, Aristotle insists emphatically, it is not true that everything has any potentiality. It is not true, therefore, that anything could happen. Could is just a synonym for potentiality. It is simply not true that anything can be followed by anything. There are laws governing what occurs in the world. The world is an ordered structure, or hierarchy of things which are related as matter to form. And therefore, if we grasp the rules by appropriate inductive, deductive methods, we can predict. We can explain a thing's behavior in terms of its nature and know what to expect. It is not a wild, chaotic, lawless universe. What a thing can do, its potentialities, depend on and derive from what it is, its actualities.
So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Wednesday insisted that Israel does not plan to expel Palestinians from Gaza or permanently occupy the territory. And this marks a shift in his rhetoric that comes one day before the International Court of Justice holds its first hearing on South Africa's genocide case against Israel. So Netanyahu said in a video posted to social media, quote, "I want to make a few points absolutely clear. Israel has no intention of permanently occupying Gaza or displacing its civilian population," end quote. And he said this in this short video that he put out, again, on social media. I saw it on Twitter. He was speaking in English, so it's clearly a message for a global audience. And Netanyahu's message, of course, is likely meant for the Biden administration as well, which has been critical of the Israeli ministers who are explicitly calling for the expulsion of Palestinians from Gaza and the establishment of Jewish settlements in the Strip. So Netanyahu said, quote, "Our goal is to rid Gaza of Hamas terrorists and free our hostages. One thing is achieved. Once this is achieved, Gaza can be demilitarized and de-radicalized, thereby creating a possibility for a better future for Israel and Palestinians alike," end quote. But Netanyahu himself just very recently has said that he favors the idea of pushing Palestinians out of Gaza. So Danny Danon, he's an Israeli member of the Knesset in Netanyahu's Likud party. He said just very recently Netanyahu was saying that getting the Palestinians out of there was a good idea. Danon told the Times of Israel, quote, "The Prime Minister told me 2 weeks ago in this room that it's a good idea. We had a faction meeting a few weeks ago when I asked him about voluntary relocation, and he said it's a good idea and not easy to find countries that would accept Gazans," end quote. And this was that Likud meeting where Netanyahu said he was looking for other countries to absorb Palestinians. And Israeli media reports have said that this idea is becoming official government policy. There's a leaked intelligence ministry document that said the best case for Israel is to kick all the Palestinians out of Gaza. But Danon said that Netanyahu has taken the idea off the table, at least for now, in the face of U.S. pressure. He said, quote, "In the last few days, because of the pressure coming from a few countries, he stated that it's not the position of the government and Israel is not promoting it. Blinken said he got assurances," end quote. So Danon and many other Israeli lawmakers and officials are still pushing for the plan to expel Palestinians, what they're calling voluntary migration, voluntary relocation. You know, we know it's not going to be voluntary considering what they're doing to Gaza. They're making it uninhabitable, destroying the homes there, the civilian infrastructure. You know, these people are not going to have a choice. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone. It says, after Secretary of State Antony Blinken traveled to Israel for high-level meetings, Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich rejected some of the diplomats' requests. Blinken asked Israel to scale down military operations in Gaza and release Palestinian tax revenue. And that's one thing. This tax money that they collect is being withheld from the Palestinian Authority. So it's money that they take from the Palestinians and they usually give to the Palestinian Authority, but they've been withholding it. And the U.S. is asking them to transfer the funds. So Smotrich wrote on X, quote, "American Secretary of State Blinken, welcome to Israel. We greatly appreciate the U.S.'s support for Israel, but as far as our existence in our country is concerned, we will always act accordingly to the Israeli interest. And so we will continue to fight with all our might to destroy Hamas. We will not transfer a shekel to the Palestinian Authority that will go to the families of Nazis in Gaza," end quote. So that's something apparently Biden asked Netanyahu to do in a phone call, and so far Israel has rejected the idea. Articles from Kyle Anzalone. Zelensky was pleading for more weapons while he was in Lithuania on Wednesday. He said, quote, "We lack modern air defense systems badly. What we need most is the air defense systems. Warehouses are empty, and there are many challenges to world defense. Sometimes the insecurity of partners regarding financial and military aid to Ukraine only increases Russia's courage and strength. Putin won't finish this war until we all finish him together. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Moldova may be next," end quote. So that's the fear-mongering that Russia will invade. You know, if Zelensky loses the war, Russia's going to, go into Eastern Europe. I mean, that's something President Biden's always saying now when he's trying to get the aid, saying that then we'll have to fight them. Then that means World War III, and we're going to send your sons and daughters to go fight and die. But it's just, there's just no basis in fact. It's just a complete nonsense narrative that Putin has his eyes on Poland and these other European countries. There was some U.S. and Chinese military talks that were recently resumed. Defense policy coordination talks in Washington is what they're called. And basically, at these talks, Chinese officials urged the U.S. to stop arming Taiwan and oppose its independence, while Pentagon officials said Washington was committed to its One China policy, which involves selling weapons to Taipei. So Taiwan is a highly sensitive and persistent issue in U.S.-China relations. Beijing sees it as a breakaway province to be reunited with mainland China by force if necessary. This article is from the South China Morning Post, by the way. I did not mention that. So this meeting came right ahead of the Taiwan elections. They're going to be held on January 13th. What is that? That's Saturday. So that's this weekend. So we'll see what happens there. And it seems like the ruling DPP party is going to win. But that's just based on polls. They actually have gotten closer. So that might not happen. But we'll see. It's going to be big when it comes to the state of U.S.-China relations in Taiwan. All right, so the last one here, how Lloyd Austin's deputy ran the Pentagon from the beach. So this article is from the Wall Street Journal. And it says, for 4 days in January, most of Washington, including President Biden, didn't know who was running the Pentagon. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin was rushed to the hospital because he had the complications from the prostate cancer surgery. And his deputy, Defense Secretary Kathleen Hicks, was on the beach. She was on vacation. And apparently she was running the Pentagon from there for a few days, which is really just something. So, she got to enjoy her time on the beach still. Wouldn't you think that's something that you would cut your vacation short for? I don't know. I don't know how these government jobs work. But anyway, I just thought that was interesting. So there's still a lot of fallout. A lot of people in Congress are want heads to roll over what happened here.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
You have an article coming out tomorrow, and it's about this guy who has sells milk, Amos Miller. And you talk about him and how the state troopers and investigators got a search warrant. The guy sells milk that, it's not, it's unadulterated and it's grass fed. He's been doing it for 40 years. He doesn't sell it, but friends of his buy it from him. And the guy's in trouble for it. And you make this point because it's really about not only that they tell us what we put in our body, you got to buy what they tell you to take, but also how we're losing our rights and what's happening to this guy.
So Amos Miller is an Amish farmer not far from where I live, but on the other side of the Delaware River in Pennsylvania. And the state police raided his farm and stole all of his farm products because of a search warrant authorizing them to do so. Now, a search warrant can only be based on probable cause of crime. This search warrant was based on the fact that someone in the state of New York got sick on a milk product and thought that it came from Amos's farm. He has never been sued, never been charged, never been held liable in any way for harming anyone. But here's a guy who sells milk that is unpasteurized and unadulterated, contrary to what the state of Pennsylvania wants. He doesn't sell it to the public. He only sells it to members of his club who state in writing, I know what I'm buying, and this is what I want, and this is all that I want to put in my body and my children's body. So this is another example of the nanny staters using the criminal process. It's a criminal proceeding because they don't like what he sells and what people choose to put in their own bodies, using the criminal process to tell us how to live. I go into the history of the Declaration of Independence and the exuberation at freedom from Great Britain in 1783 and then say, well, where did all that freedom go? It's gone. It's gone. We have less freedom today than the colonists did who fought a revolution against the king. Taxation without representation is tyranny. Kind of a canard. They really didn't want representation in the British Parliament. They wanted to be away from, free of the British Parliament. But the taxes over which they revolted, none of them exceeded 3%. Today, of course, what we pay in the Northeast could be upwards of 50 to 58 or 59%. So half your time is spent working for the government, and 3% was enough to trigger a revolution. So this infuriated me. This nanny state do-gooder will tell you what to put into your body. We know what's better for you than you know for yourself attitude. And what really infuriated me was the use of the criminal process to enforce this. Instead of sending him a letter saying, we think that you're not selling safe products, and they can have a debate over that. Boom, the FBI, not the FBI, the state police show up, knock on the door, walk in, steal everything he has, and then put a sign up saying, do not enter, do not buy anything from this place. It's unsafe and it's unhealthy. Who the hell are the police to say that? So that's what motivated me to write the column.
What happened to this guy? How did it end up?
Nothing. Nothing so far. I don't know what legal procedures, if any, have followed this. The events that I just described took place last Thursday, so that's 7 days ago.
So he lost everything. They have everything. They stole all his stuff.
Correct. I mean, he can remake it. He still got the cows, but it's an expensive process to remake it. They stole cream. They stole sour cream. They stole eggnog. They stole milk. Stole. Not looking for a sample of, but taking everything he has.
And it's a joke. I mean, look at all the products, all the crap in all these products that are killing people, all these artificial thises and that's, and they bust this guy's chops for nothing.
Right.
By the way, how dare anybody drink a natural product? It has to be pasteurized. I mean, who can make up this crap? A bunch of crap heads. So what do you think is going to happen with this Israel war?
I think it's going to expand, and they're going to try some sort of a false flag, some sort of an attack on American troops to drag the United States into it. And Joe Biden will welcome that because his belief is that he can only get reelected if he runs as a wartime president. So they'll concoct a war. I think they were going to do that in Ukraine, but it's too little, too late. Ukraine is lost. Even though Mike Johnson wants to send them another and Joe Biden wants to send, and Chuck Schumer want to send them another $68 billion. But the war in Israel is real and is likely to expand, and the Americans are likely to get involved.
I agree with you, by the way. This is going to continue to expand, and there'll be either a false flag or something will happen to get us involved in there. And World War III has begun. And if we don't stop it, it's going to be annihilation. I'm really concerned about it. There's our cover of this week's magazine. And
well, you're playing with fire with people who have nuclear weapons, and in the case of Israel, many of them, the hard right people and Netanyahu's cabinet, the ones he was complaining about that if they leave, I don't have a coalition. They are religious fanatics, so there's really no reasoning with them. These are people who Phil Giraldi's going to be on today also, and he's going to talk about the case of South Africa versus Israel, which is going to be tried starting tomorrow. And the complaint in that case, which is 84 pages long, has copious comments from members of the cabinet, like the Palestinians are subhuman. We should turn Palestine into, or we should turn the Gaza Strip into a soccer field. They should be buried alive. I mean, you talk about intent. The intent to commit genocide is right there.
And they call them animals too.
Correct. Yep. So this is not a circumstantial evidence case. There is profound evidence. I mean, I don't know what the Israeli defense will consist of. The Israeli government said this is a blood libel. All right. Blood libel goes back to conspiracy theories about Catholic priests using the blood of Jewish boys to mix it with the wine that was consecrated at Mass. It was a horrible thing. It never happened. It was entirely made up. It's a 500-year-old event. That's what they compared this allegation to. The allegation is true. It is true what they said about the Palestinians. It is true that they're trying to exterminate them. It is true that that is a violation of the Treaty on Genocide and the United Nations Charter. We'll see what this court says. It's an odd court. There are 13 judges. The plaintiff, South Africa, gets to add a judge. The defendant, the Israelis, get to add a judge. So they both added their judges. There'll be 15 judges who will start to hear the case tomorrow. There's no testimony. It's just the oral argument of lawyers. The first thing they have to decide is if they have jurisdiction. If they have jurisdiction, they're going to rule against Israel. No question about it.
But again, we have to do something to stop this. And everybody, please do what you can to bring peace on earth. United we stand, divided we die. And of course, if you want to donate to Occupy Peace, we very much appreciate it. Could you imagine if these billionaires donated to Occupy Peace?
Not a maybe we'll get lucky. Maybe one of them will show up at your next rally.
Yeah.
And I think this is the way that the mainstream media is going to frame it. Iran hijacks oil tanker in Gulf of Oman. Now they sound like pirates. They hijacked an oil tanker. It sounds like out of the blue. I'm not criticizing Zero Hedge here. They're actually done us a favor by previewing how it will come out in the mainstream media. But Iranian naval forces acting under a court order seized Marshall Islands flag tanker St. Nicholas, Bloomberg reports, citing Iran's semi-official Tassim agency. The report said St. Nicholas is a U.S. oil tanker. So Iran, in the midst of all of these tensions increasing, they go out and steal and seize a tanker. Now here's from the same article. This is a tweet. If we go to the next one, to tankertracker.com with more background. The tanker which the Iranians have boarded today in the Gulf of Oman is the St. Nicholas, carrying Iraqi oil. And this is where it gets interesting, Dr. Paul. formerly known as the Suez Rajan. She was seized by the U.S. government for having transported 1 million barrels of Iranian oil in connection to a U.S. company. So initially, this ship was seized by the U.S. government because it had Iranian oil. And we told the Iranians they're not allowed to sell their oil. And this is an example of the international rules-based order. We make the rules, you take the orders. And it didn't work this way because the Iranians, there's this expectation that they're just going to forget that we stole 1 billion barrels of their oil. Well, they don't. Countries don't forget these slights. But nevertheless, we talk a lot about narratives. And this is a narrative, and this is going to be how it sells. They stole a U.S. ship. And already we're seeing the neocons. Put the next one up. The neocons are braying for war over this. Iran knows it can attack ships and now seize them because the Ayatollahs know Joe Biden is too weak to respond. In other words, why haven't we attacked them yet? That's why they're seizing our ships. We haven't declared war. So that's how the neocons are going to frame this.
And the real fight going on is the propaganda on both sides. But it seems like our side is sort of desperate to how to put a positive spin on this. But already we have people saying that if you don't go along with with the scenario, that you have to say we've been hijacked and we better do something about it. And if not, you're too weak. And you call Biden too weak, but we have neoconservatives and Republicans are saying, oh, we can't act weak. But the neocons want to spin this in a way of they're almost like on a noble cause. Yeah. It's all about money and oil and this sort of thing and power. But they also always talk about patriotism, and we have a few in the Congress that sort of annoys me, to say the least, on their attitude that you have to go along with this militancy, and they never say, well, our friends at the military-industrial complex, they need this activity. This is the way the appropriations get done. This is the way we've done it for 50 years or longer, and so they want to justify it and they want to paint it. And it was the same way when I wanted to bring troops home in the Middle East and save some of that killing. They say, well, you're not being patriotic. You're not for the defense of America. And it just happens that non-intervention is the best defense that America could be offered, and that is what they reject.
And this is something that may happen in the future. And this raises it to a whole new level. If you can put this next one up, this is from Bloomberg. White House throws support behind seizing frozen Russian assets. And go to the next clip, because President Joe Biden's administration is backing legislation that would let it seize some $300 billion in frozen Russian assets to help pay for reconstruction of Ukraine, a shift as the White House seeks to rally support in Congress to further fund the war. The memo from the NSC says this bill would provide the authority needed for the executive branch to seize Russian sovereign assets for the benefit of Ukraine. So in a sense, what the administration is saying is, we're going to do to Russia just what we did to Iran.
I always try to draw lines at a certain place where you step over the line of constitutionality and morality. And when it comes to this sort of thing, the line that I draw is that if you put on sanctions and you're powerful enough to do it to serve your own interests, that you're actually participating in an act of war. Yeah. I think a sanction is like a blockade. And nobody in this country would want them to do it to us. Matter of fact, they get hysterical if they had a little bit of retaliation. But the sanctions is a form of blockade. You're cutting off supplies, and it's done for very, very self-centered reasons. Territory, money, the empire, all of these things, and it may be a few lobbyists that come to town that benefit from all this nonsense.
Speaker Johnson pledges to stand shoulder to shoulder for defense of Taiwan. I don't know. He met with the leader of Taiwan recently, and he said, "Hey, we're with you. We're going to support you against Chinese aggression." So.
In the position over the years, as it's been a pseudo-neutral position. We don't. It's a position that hasn't been in the face of China and not insisting, that these countries be separate, and we've recognized that and got by. But this type of talk means that we're antagonizing China, and it doesn't make for better relations. And I still remember how impressed I was about when we went from the Korean War into an era of where things moved in a different direction, and then Nixon, in a moment of sanity, said, maybe it's better we just trade with China, and it hasn't been that bad. Yeah. At least we're not shooting and killing each other. But this kind of stuff means that it could lead to this again. So that's why I think it's an example to verify what the founders argued, that if you trade with countries, you're less likely to have war with them, and if you have a war with them, introduce the whole notion of voluntary trade and limit ourselves. But this stuff of of majority rule. As long as you get majority support in the U.S. Congress, we can do anything we want. And if you don't do it, you're unpatriotic. That's their tool, and that's a tool that we have to expose. So the American people, I think, are becoming more aware of that. But we have a ways to go because it's very easy to scare the people and say, especially if next week if they sink an American vessel, that is doing something illegally, you can change that in a few minutes because the people would be so determined for retaliation. And it must be part of human nature because we don't have too many years or decades where you really live in peace with most of the world. And unfortunately, we've moved in the wrong direction in the past 10 years.
Yeah,
I think they have an impossible situation because whether they're right, left, middle, or whatever we have in Congress talking, they basically endorse the principle of interventionism, that the government's there to intervene and make sure, trade is fair and diverse and all that nonsense that goes on. So they set that up. But if both sides really believe in interventionism, it says, whose interventionism should we live by? And they pretend that there's a little bit of difference. Today, people would argue with me if I say, well, basically, since they both endorse interventionism, the fact that Bidenomics is a big issue. Oh, it's turned out not to do so well. Well, yeah, there are some things. Within the principles of interventionism, you can have a certain rate of taxes on our income and argue about it. And some argue for more, some argue for less. But maybe they should allow a better debate on how about an income tax of zero. Then we would know exactly what we're talking about. Who owns our income? Who owns us? And I would say modern day slavery has endorsed the principle where we just bow to the saints that are in Washington.
Actualities determine potentialities, a fundamental law of Aristotelian metaphysics. And that actually is the real metaphysical basis of the distinction we covered in epistemology between essence and properties, because the essence is really the actuality of the thing, and the property is the consequences of that essence. So this is really the metaphysical basis of Aristotle's theory of explanation. What a thing is matter for depends on its form. Now, I might add parenthetically, this is the basis for a formal proof of the law of cause and effect. And the proof is very simple. If you combine this premise with the law of identity, you simply say a thing in a given set of circumstances can, i.e. has the potentiality to act only in one way, the way dictated by its nature. In any given set of circumstances, an entity with a certain nature has only one potentiality, and that is therefore how it will have to behave. And the same entity, under the same circumstances, will therefore always behave that way. In other words, same cause, same effect. Anything else would involve a contradiction of the nature of the entity, the ascription to it of a potentiality conflicting with its actuality. Now you see, that is a perfectly unanswerable formal proof of cause and effect. Now, I should say that this is implicit in Aristotle, in the way I've just indicated, but not explicit. This is one of the places where Aristotle's Platonism, judged by the surviving documents in any event, got the better of him. And in many places, he indicates that he does not subscribe to the universal reign of cause and effect. And I will mention some of those next week. So apparently, Aristotle had no clear idea, explicitly, of the universal reign of law in the universe. Apparently. But in any event, he bequeathed to his followers the fundamental premises, from which it does not take too much intelligence to construct an actual proof. The importance of this discovery is that it represents the primacy of existence approach to the law of cause and effect, as against both the mystic and the skeptic approach to that question. The typical mystic approach to cause and effect is to say the reason things are so orderly is because God wants them that way. He derives causality, law, and order from the activity of a supernatural designing being. That's the so-called argument from design. Of course there must be a supernatural consciousness, because who could make a tree behave so well if it weren't for God? That's the primacy of consciousness approach to causality. And as against that, there's the skeptic approach, which had its adherents in the ancient world, and Nicodemus is an example, and of course its most famous adherent in the modern world, David Hume, who denied causality altogether and said all he knows is that anything could happen at any time, and if you throw a penny in the air, for all he knows, it could turn into Hegel. Of course, he didn't use that example, not being imaginative enough to foresee Hegel. Nevertheless, a truly Aristotelian point of view is to say that both of these points of view, the divine miracle-ass point of view and the Humean skeptic point of view on causality, are contradictory. They imply a contradiction. They imply the possibility of an entity acting in contradiction to its nature. Either or both views imply that, and therefore both are out.
The U.S. and Britain on Thursday night launched strikes against more than a dozen sites in Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen where the majority of Yemenis live, in a move that risks escalating the situation in the Middle East into a major regional war. A U.S. official told CNN that the strikes were launched by fighter jets and Tomahawk missiles fired by warships and submarines, and the U.S. is claiming that they targeted Houthi drone and missile sites and military sites. Yemeni media reported strikes in several cities, including in the capital Sana'a and in the Red Sea port of Hodeidah. President Biden said in a statement that the strikes received support from Australia, Canada, the Netherlands, and Bahrain. So that's some coalition that they have there. Australia, Canada, the Netherlands, and Bahrain, and the UK. He claimed that the U.S. and Britain, quote, successfully conducted strikes against a number of targets in Yemen used by Houthi rebels to endanger freedom of navigation, end quote. The bombing of Yemen came in response to the Houthi attacks on Israeli-linked commercial shipping in the Red Sea that started in protest of the U.S.-backed Israeli onslaught in Gaza. The Houthis, officially known as Ansar Allah, have vowed not to back down in the face of the U.S. military and said their attacks in the Red Sea will only stop once the Israeli slaughter in Gaza ends. So ahead of the U.S. and British strikes on Yemen, there was reports pretty much all day on Thursday that they were planning this and that British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak was holding a cabinet meeting where he authorized these strikes. So they knew this was coming, and the Houthis were putting out warnings. And Abdel Malik al-Houthi, who's the group's leader, he said, quote, any American attack will not remain without a response. The response will be greater than the attack that was carried out with 20 drones and a number of missiles, end quote. So far, there have been no reports on the number of casualties caused by the U.S. and British strikes. Considering it seemed like these were pretty widespread, I'm sure there were some casualties. Haven't seen anything yet on that. And the U.S. and its allies have a history of killing civilians in Yemen, as the UN estimated in 2021 that about 377,000 people were killed by the U.S.-backed Saudi-UAE war against the Houthis that started in 2015. 377,000 people. And more than half of them died of starvation and disease caused by the blockade and the coalition's brutal bombing campaigns. So that war, I mean, just to, it's on par with how brutal what Israel is doing in Gaza is, what the Saudis were doing in Yemen with full U.S. support. I mean, the Israeli bombing of Gaza is on a higher scale, like, I guess, kind of the number of airstrikes that they're launching. But the Saudis were bombing civilian infrastructure, homes, they were bombing farms, sewage treatment plants, all things like that, to really wage war against the civilian population of Yemen. That included the blockade, which is still in force today. It hasn't been fully lifted. It's been eased. The situation is much better right now for the people on the ground in Yemen, but this risks shattering the truce that's been held between the Saudis and the Houthis since April 2022. Although I will say that the Saudis have distanced themselves from the U.S. anti-Houthi activity in the Red Sea. The question is, if they let the U.S. use their airspace to launch strikes on Yemen, I think the Houthis might not be happy about that, but we'll see how it plays out between them. But either way, this thing's going to escalate in some form. And some members of Congress have criticized President Biden for launching the strikes in Yemen without congressional authorization. So I saw this tweet from Ro Khanna. He's a Democrat from California in the House. He said, quote, the president needs to come to Congress before launching a strike against the Houthis in Yemen and involving us in another Middle East conflict. That is Article 1 of the Constitution, end quote. And then before I started recording, I was just scrolling Twitter, and I saw a pretty good amount of members of Congress saying something similar or kind of retweeting what Ro Khanna said and saying that they agree, both on the Democratic side and the Republican side. So more than $1 billion in weapons that were shipped to Ukraine have not been properly tracked by the Pentagon, a report from the Defense Department's Inspector General has found. The report examined $1.699 billion in weapons sent to Ukraine that are subject to enhanced end-use monitoring, which includes Javelin anti-tank missiles, Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, night vision goggles, other types of weapons, certain types of missiles. It's basically smaller, more portable things that can be smuggled easily and sent out to the black market. They're supposed to have more tracking of these types of weapons. So if you look at the numbers here, we're only talking about $1 billion worth of weapons, but considering how much the U.S. has sent, that might not sound like much. But this is just examining basically $1.7 billion in weapons that they sent, and they found that the majority of it, $1.005 billion, was not tracked, was not accounted for after it was sent to Ukraine. And this was nearly 40,000 weapons. So, there has been this whole policy of just dumping weapons into Ukraine has been done with very little oversight. And the number here of weapons that they examined is just a small fraction of the over $40 billion in weapons that the U.S. has either sent to Ukraine or promised that they'll give Ukraine in the future. it's just another indication. And there's been efforts to establish a inspector general for Ukraine, but those have been voted down.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
U.S. deficit tops $500 billion in the first quarter of fiscal year. Yep. The U.S. government ran up another $500 billion in red ink in the first quarter. The Treasury Department. Oh, Treasury Department? Hey, look who's running the Treasury Department. Ms. Fatja Brut, Janet Yellen. Oh, what was the last job? Fed head? Yeah. Well, listen to everything that they tell you. Because if you listen to everything they tell you, then you like bullshit. Yep. Just saying that if the current pace continues, 2024 will end with a deficit of just more than $2 trillion. And remember, we got a $34 trillion debt load. So, Iran seizes oil tanker, linked to U.S. sanctions dispute. Wall Street Journal today. The tanker was being diverted to Iranian waters after it was seized between the coasts of Oman and Iran. Maritime intelligence. They're all fucking intelligence. They're officials. We're intelligence. I love it. I'm a minister of minister of defense. So other shit names. All right. The vessel was previously commandeered by the United States. Oh, so Iran's not allowed to take back the vessel that the United States stole for them. No, we're the United States. We can kill anybody we want all over the world. And Israel's on our side. Same thing, same game. Yep, same crime syndicate. The U.S. is now considering targeting land-based Houthi positions in Yemen in response to this. And now the UK, that guy Sudak, Sundak, shit show. Yep. What the fuck is the United States and the UK? It was never set on the British Empire. We slaughtered people all over the world. Only killed about 400 million in India when we took over, according to the data, for all the shit that they did to them. So this thing is ramping up. It's one of your top trends for 2024. World War III. Got it. American intel officials warn of risk of Hezbollah attacking U.S. That's the latest coming out. What did we tell you? Major false flag that's going to get America into the war, and all the little people will march off, just as they did with little Georgie Bush, swallowing the bullshit coming out of a little piece of shit with a pecker smaller than that. A little daddy's boy born on third base and thought he had a home run. We're going to get that guy Osama bin Laden dead or alive. Look what he did with 9/11. Yeah. Bullshit. What else? Britain is expected to join the United States in conducting overnight strikes. Yep, great. And then that guy Austin, that Lloyd Austin. How Austin kept nearly everyone in the dark. For days in January, most of Washington, including President Biden, didn't know who was running the Pentagon. He was rushed to Walter Reed National. I'm only mentioning this because Austin did it. You know why? I'm a general. You're just a bunch of privates. I'm a general. I'll tell you what to do. You got it? That's the attitude of the guy whose last job was sitting on the board of directors of Raytheon, the second largest defense contractor in the United States. And that's what you got. Oh, here's a great article. The Wall Street Journal. Big article. Ready? Doomed battle tells story of stalled war. Rout of elite Ukrainian forces shows counteroffensive's steep odds. The planners of Ukraine's counteroffensive against the country Russia invaders last year envisioned the elite forces. This is the kind of bullshit they say. Oh, the counteroffensive that was a failure, that we said would be a failure? Don't count on the counteroffensive, one of your covers of the Trends Journal. And now they're finally admitting it after all this time, after they sold the bullshit over and over and over of how the counteroffensive was going to happen. The spring counteroffensive that just began like at the end of the spring and just about the beginning of summer. And going back to, by the way, that guy, Lloyd Austin, there's an article. The self-reinforcing quality of corporate lobbying has increasingly come to overwhelm every other potentially countervailing force. It was by a guy named Lee Drutman. Something is out of balance in Washington. Corporations now spend $2.6 billion a year on reported lobbying expenditures. Isn't that great? And we got a lot more. Oh, wait, this is big news. That guy, Chris Christie exits race. Yeah. They have a door big enough for him to get out of. What a fucking joke that he was even running. Only going to Ukraine to give support. And again, a slob that couldn't fight his way out of a paper bag. Loves war. These are the shitheads running the show.
Welcome to Liberty Lockdown. Please scan your barcode. Your liberty ain't gone, but yeah, it's on hold.
Concerned about their corruption. If you had somebody who actually one of the most prominent black influencer the other day, what did she say? I've been black my whole life, and this man could actually unify this country, in response to a long exchange I had with a black pastor who had an event here in Iowa. Did challenge me with a hard question, asking me, are my views against affirmative action, how do those align with historical racial injustice?
Affirmative action is a debate that is being had.
If I may just finish this. If I may finish my point,
deal with
Dasha.
racism,
I think I will be
but
better
you're denying that racism is a
I've never denied that racism is a problem. If you listen to the response I gave to that black pastor, my whole point is racism has been a major problem for most of our national history. But we're getting close to the promised land that Martin Luther King envisioned. We're as darn close to it as we ever have been. And so what bothers the heck out of me is it's right when we're close to that promised land. Martin Luther King said it, I may not get there with you, and he didn't get there with us. But I think it desecrates the legacy of our civil rights movement, desecrates the legacy of Martin Luther King, that right when we get closest to the point of having racial equality and gender equality and even opportunities for people of minorities of many types, are we perfect? No. But are we as close as we've ever been? Yes, we have. To then obsess over systemic racism, to then obsess over white guilt and otherwise, we're creating new waves of racism, Dasha, that we otherwise would have avoided right when we're closest to having achieved what even the proponents of the civil rights movement would have dreamed of. That's what bothers me. My exchange with that black pastor about a week or so ago, right here in Iowa, not far from where we are, it was in Indianola, not far from where we are in Des Moines, was that we're founded on the pursuit of a more perfect union, the pursuit of liberty, equality, and justice for all. And I reject this left-wing narrative that's creating more artificial division. So I believe I will bring more black and Hispanic voters into our movement, not by saying fake poll-tested slogans, but by speaking the hard truth, that we've been imperfect in our past, but let us celebrate the progress we've made and reject the media's cherry-picking narratives to actually get to the truth of the matter. And now if we care about black lives, the things we're going to do isn't obsessing about white supremacy. It's actually fixing the problems in our cities, which I will do as our president.
One of the best answers I've ever seen in my life. I mean, it's remarkable. It's remarkable. And I know he's not to be trusted and he's a pharma guy. And okay. Maybe none of what he said is actually his deeply held belief. I don't think so, though. I don't. I think that you simply cannot give a 5-minute answer on the fly under the gun from a press talking head that's trying to, derail your campaign. And do it in a way that is so perfect, so perfect. And if he's doing that just because he thinks it's the best thing to say and he doesn't believe any of it, well then you fooled me, Vivek. You fooled me. But back to the point, I think he's exactly right. I mean, if we are to get past the historical injustices of racism in this country, we cannot increase the divide based off of reporting biases. And that's what we're witnessing. This is the head of Google's DEI department, Adriel Parker. Let's hear what she has to say.
In the year 2023, it also amazes me how many people are like, well, I don't see color, or it would be so much better if we just didn't worry about someone's skin tone. You as an individual are contributing to the problem because our broader society sees color, and it's not just physically seeing a color. There is so much more to it than just that. And if you don't understand that, you are, again, part of the problem. And it's just to keep telling people that over.
I mean, is that not exactly like the argumentation that the KKK made back in the early 1900s? It's like, you're naive. We see color, so you must as well. Just once again, showing like, is it woke or white supremacist? Who knows? Can't tell the difference.
Over is so frustrating. And I was just on TikTok and there's a trend where parents are teaching their kids not to see color, quote unquote. And I'm like,
good parents.
Okay, so the next round of people that are going to be joining our workforce, this next generation, are going to be dealing with the same issues that we're dealing with now. Because to say you don't see color, you don't see me. You don't care to acknowledge the struggles that people like me face. And we're not looking for problems. We're not,
I'm sorry. I don't even have commentary on that, just as much as it's frustrating. It's so sad. It's so regressive. You're dragging us back into a time that I don't want to participate in. I'm not interested in it, and I reject it entirely. And that is not to discount your struggles. It is to say that I don't believe that focusing on what you want us to focus on will ultimately alleviate your struggles. I think it will worsen them. That's the truth. All right. Topic du jour with this.
I know I'm prejudiced.
With this whole DEI stuff.
I know I'm prejudiced. I know I'm bigoted in a lot of different ways. And I've said this before. If I see a black kid in a hoodie at night on the other side of the street, I'm probably on the same side of the street. I'm probably going to walk to the other side of the street.
I love it. I love it when they just say it, man. Look, I'll be honest. If I see anybody of any variety that's wearing a hoodie and I'm walking down an alleyway or something, I might be like, all right, maybe this isn't prudent to put myself in a position where I might be able to get mugged or something like that. Especially if you're in a city that has crime issues. But it's just so funny that the folks that push the DEI mindset are the most really racist and bigoted amongst us. Like the people that are constantly trying to get us to focus on race. We have to focus on it. Oh, you're part of the problem. You're raising your kids not to see it. You're raising your kids to think that we're equal. You're part of the problem.
We shouldn't be repeating names that are on the list, because just because your name has not on the list, but in the documents, just because your name is on the documents doesn't mean that you have done anything criminally irresponsible or illegal or civilly irresponsible. Or that you were a client. Or that you were a client. It only really, these documents as I read them, only reflect Epstein's sexual assaults of women and his sexual behavior. So I think that... And Ghislaine? Also, and Ghislaine. And so being named in the suit does not equate to being accused of wrongdoing. And I think that is extremely important, because conspiracy theorists seem to not understand or enjoy facts. Yeah, these are the facts. Yes.
It's just fantastic. Now, by the way, you can go find, there's clips on CNN and MSNBC of them saying the exact same thing. It's just, oh my God. It's like it's so fucking rich. Yeah, that's what's important here. That's what's important. And those are the facts. And it's these damn conspiracy theorists. Dude, the story is Jeffrey Epstein. Here are the facts that she says conspiracy theories don't like facts or whatever. Okay. Well, here are the facts. There was a child rapist ring, an organization based on raping children that involved the most powerful members of our society. And the guy who ran it was known to be partying with all of these powerful people, politicians and people in the media and people in Hollywood. And they're all at least from some degrees connected to it. And it seems pretty clear that it was a blackmail operation where he was luring people into fucking children and then blackmailing them with the information that they had. And the government knew about this and allowed it to continue. But your takeaway of what's important about this here is that we don't damage the reputations of any of the people who were close to it. That's the danger, but not an absolute demand that just think about this story and just imagine a world where we didn't have media that was made up of the most corrupt people who are strictly in the business of defending power. Like, imagine we had a media with a shred of honesty. Every single day, they would be demanding to know everybody who was involved in this. We would never look at any of those people the same way until we find out, I'm sorry, this is like, what? A child rapist ring? Who the hell was involved with this? Because there's all these powerful people there. When did you know what? Like, the onus would totally be on them. You know what I mean? Like, when did you know what? Did you go to any of his parties? What did you see at these parties? You kept going back to them after that? Why? What was going on? You know what I'm saying? Like, these people, it's insane that your takeaway would just be, well, we don't really have to worry about, getting to the bottom of this, but let's just make sure we don't cast aspersions on anybody who's in these lists. Bill Clinton, it's like, yeah, okay, he was the president of the United States. He's been credibly accused of rape by like 6 women. You know that guy? Yeah, he happened to party with a guy who was running a child rapist ring, and we got pictures of him getting massages from one of the victims. And yeah, he flew with him on his private plane to Thailand. He went with Jeffrey Epstein to Thailand. What do you do with Jeffrey Epstein in Thailand? Am I a conspiracy theorist for like maybe having some questions about that? It's just so bonkers, dude. It's so bonkers. How do you even have this conversation? And this is what these people, these dummies on The View and these dummies on CNN and MSNBC do. Their job is to stay on there and say, okay, the most important thing about this story here is that we don't go convicting Bill Clinton in our mind. Okay? Let's not jump to conclusions. And you're like, okay, so let's not jump to conclusions and then what? Give him a grilling interview about it? No. Just don't jump to conclusions. And then we'll talk about how racist Trump is or something like that. You could be the #1 pundit in cable news right now. If you just said, dude, I'm doing every episode on Epstein. Every episode of my show, I'm going to be bringing people on, grilling them about this. We're going to be pouring over what we know about this. We're going to be demanding that all of the people who are on the flight logs and all the people who are in these documents are held to account, and that we're asking all of these questions of them. That would guaranteed be the #1 show in cable news. I think you'd break 10 million views if you just did a show on that. But they don't. And why is that? Because their primary driver, their primary motivation is not ratings. And that's a really important thing for people to recognize, that it's not just a business that's trying to make money. Because people get this wrong all the time, where people say, oh, the problem with the corporate press is that it's all, it's private, and it's capitalist, and they just want money. So they'll just do whatever gets clicks. But that's not right. They avoid things that would get so many views, would get so many clicks, because they're primarily in the business of defending the powerful. That's why they're the enemy of the people, because they're working against your interests on behalf of powerful people. And this is just the most obvious example of it. If none of this stuff with Epstein had come out, and anyone had just laid out what we know, the stuff we know now to be the case, and just said that, they'd have been labeled the craziest conspiracy theorists in the world. What are you talking about? They got an island where they rape kids? What are you talking about, right? Okay, but we found out all that's true. So I'm sorry, you don't get to use this conspiracy theorists. They just don't care about facts anymore. This woman doesn't care. This lady doesn't care about any facts. She cares about making sure that you don't jump to conclusions about powerful people who were connected to Jeffrey Epstein. That's really the most important takeaway. Now, who does that sound like she's on the side of? The American people or the powerful people? I love this story because it's just like, there it is. I'm sorry, this is an open and shut case, black and white. They're your enemy.
The Peter Schiff Show.
All right, I'm going over the December jobs report that came out on Friday last week. Of the 216,000 jobs that were supposedly created, of course, we'll find out next month and in the month after that how many of these jobs were just fictitious, because they're going to revise the number down, just like they always do. But 52,000 of these jobs were government jobs. That's a quarter of the jobs. We're on the hook to pay the salaries of these workers. We don't want government jobs. They're expensive. We got to pay for them. If somebody gets a job in the private sector, it doesn't cost me any money, unless, of course, I'm the one hiring them. But if some business hires somebody, then that doesn't affect me. I mean, sure, if I go to that company and I buy a product or use their services, then I'm paying for those services and the labor is embedded in the price, but I'm getting something that I want, and I'm doing that voluntarily. Nobody forces me to go to a business and help that employer pay his workers by buying what they're selling. But when the governments hire somebody, where do you think they get the money? They don't have any money. They got to take it from the taxpayer. Now, at least the state governments, city government, they honestly take it because they don't have a printing press. But to the extent that there's some federal employees here, well, they're just going to print more money. The budget deficits are going to be bigger, and prices are going to go up even more because government workers were hired. I mean, these are non-productive workers, right? I mean, most of the time. I mean, not all government workers. I mean, there's a few of them that actually contribute something, but the vast majority don't. They're just dead weight. And so the fact that all these jobs are government jobs, this is not good news. We need to lose government jobs. That would be good news, like what Malay is doing down in Argentina. We may end up doing one of our first events down there in Argentina, or maybe that'll be our second event at Schiff Sovereign. I'm excited about what's going on down there. But they're firing government workers. That's good news. The fact that more of them are being hired, that is bad news. But we got more bad news on inflation that the markets don't even really understand. I mean, we got some actual bad inflation news today, but before today's bad inflation news, last week, we got November consumer credit. And nobody was talking about the inflationary impact of this consumer credit report. The definition of inflation, remember, is an increase in a supply of money. Well, it also includes credit. So technically, inflation is an increase in a supply of money and credit. And that's because consumers use credit to buy stuff. They bid up prices. And it's more money chasing fewer goods, right? That's the dynamic of inflation. And so credit, if consumers don't have money, but they have credit, and they can go into a store and they can buy stuff with credit, same thing as buying stuff with money. It's the demand that is pushing up prices. So the consensus forecast for consumer credit increase in November was $9.5 billion. The actual increase was $23.7 billion. That's 4 times what the markets had been expecting to happen. And the other numbers that were embedded in that report, total consumer credit exceeded $5 trillion for the first time ever. So credit growth is expanding. Credit card debt by itself increased by $19.5 billion in 1 month. That is the third biggest monthly increase in consumer credit card debt in the history of them keeping track, which I think went back into the early 1940s. And of course, before that, consumers really didn't borrow much money, right? We were a nation of frugal savers. We didn't have to borrow money. There were no credit cards, right? So, but they were introduced at some point, and so this is the third biggest. Now, This is not a sign of economic strength. First of all, interest rates on credit cards are at all-time record highs. You would think that Americans would want to borrow less on their credit cards because interest rates are so high. But no, they're borrowing more. Why? Because they have no choice. It's either put your groceries on your credit card or you don't eat. That is what is going on. Consumers are drowning in debt. This is not a sign of a strong economy. We've got all these jobs. Why do we have so much debt? Right? If so many people have so many jobs, why can't they afford to buy things? Why do they have to max out their credit cards? Why have we never seen this kind of increase in consumer credit as the savings rate has plunged? Now, the reason this is an inflationary report is because it shows that nothing that the Fed has done is moving the needle on inflation. I don't care that the official rate has gone down from 9 to 3 and change. That's just the ebbs and flows of the measuring cycles. We're moving up. We're going to go back to 9. We're not going back down to 2. We're going to new highs. Because the only way that the Fed is going to fight inflation successfully, it's got to cut back on spending and increase savings. Credit needs to be contracting. People have to stop buying stuff on their credit cards and save their money, right? Not buy things. That's what's going to take the upward pressure off prices. But the Fed has not done that at all. Interest rates have not moved up nearly enough to discourage borrowing. It's going on anyway. And not just the individuals, the government. Budget deficits have never been this high despite the Fed's rate hikes. So in other words, we still have expansionary fiscal policy. We're running bigger deficits than ever before. The government is stepping on the gas when it comes to inflation. Even though the Fed is tapping the brakes, they're not tapping the brakes hard enough to stop the momentum of the car. Hey, we're still moving forward. We're still creating inflation. And these consumer credit numbers prove that.
With some quotes from Noah Webster in his great paper, The Revolution in France in 1794, which he sent to George Washington. I've got the letter that he sent along with that in just a few minutes. But here's how Webster put it. Nothing is more dangerous to the cause of truth and liberty than a party spirit. To Noah Webster, if your first thought was how to be loyal to the team and how to defend the team, that is the most dangerous thing to the cause of truth and liberty. And he explained why. Because you get this kind of attachment to the wrong thing, to the wrong principle. He said, when men are once united, in whatever form or upon whatever occasion, the union creates a partiality or friendship for each member of the party or society. A coalition for any purpose creates an attachment and inspires a confidence in the individuals of the party, which does not die with the cause which united them, but continues and extends to every other object of social intercourse. And I could come up with an almost endless list of similar warnings along these lines. But thanks to government-run education, most people are totally ignorant of this, and they would reject this view just almost immediately after hearing it. And I guess Thomas Jefferson was absolutely correct when he said, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be. Now, this ignorance, I think, on this count should be totally obvious to all of us here today, especially when we consider the fact that so many people who claim to be opposed to endless wars absolutely love the so-called peace president who kept going with a bunch of wars and even started some new ones. Or on the other end of the spectrum, the political spectrum that is, so many people who claim to support the natural right of self-defense, the right to keep and bear arms, they put all their support behind the so-called Second Amendment president, the same dude who actually enforced more federal gun control than anyone in history and bragged about it. Absolutely terrible on both ends of the spectrum on this stuff. But anyways, this is nothing new under the sun whatsoever. And I want to go back to Thomas Gordon, who I've cited on the show a number of times in his great Works of Sallust. Gordon was a great influence on the founders. I'll get to that in a moment. This is from 1744. And Gordon put it this way. It is with measures as with men. They are praised or condemned, not because they are right or wrong, beneficial or hurtful, but because they come from this party or the other. Sure sounds familiar, doesn't it? It explains why you can see, depending on which administration or which team is in power in Washington, D.C., you can see how the opposing team who previously supported the same kind of actions all of a sudden think it's the worst thing on earth, or vice versa. People flip-flop back and forth on the exact same type of federal power, depending on who does it. And this is a great example of what we live under right now. Gordon continued, evil is turned into good, and good into evil. Truth passes for falsehood. Falsehood is dressed up in the guise of truth. The best actions are decried as the worst if they arise from one quarter. The worst actions adored as the best if from the other. So people totally set aside any moral or constitutional principles because their number one goal is to support the party or the team. Thomas Gordon again put it like this: party principles are therefore substituted for moral principles. The sure way to destroy all morality and to confound the characters of men and even those of good and evil. Gordon continued. He said, yet from this spirit, this baneful and pestilent spirit of party, the ablest and best men are often precluded from the service of their country, the weakest, the worst, and most contemptible employed in its service. Often get people asking us to do this kind of thing. Why don't you spend more time talking about Joe? Why don't you spend more time talking about Barry or George or Donald? And we got to focus all of our energy on that rather than the overarching principle that we're focusing on, that the founding generation warned us about, and that is too much consolidation, too much centralization of power, no matter who has the power, because it's not a personnel problem that we're facing. We're facing an issue of power. And the faction first people want us always to focus on the personnel because it feeds into their goals, which is to elevate their team and attack the other. Anyways, Gordon continued. And therefore, some public talkers have grown popular by calling those whom they disliked by bitter and ill-bred names, or by rioting and making a noise for some sounds which they had taken a liking to, or by insulting and abusing those who affronted them, by being more sober and sensible than the others. Anyways, this is basically political discourse of today. This dude is dumb. This dude is brilliant. I'm great. You're stupid. And this just leads to more and more of the same. People setting aside principles to support or oppose teams. Here's Gordon again, Cato's letter number 134 in 1723. He said, so that in raising parties and factions, inflaming goes 1,000 times farther than reasoning and teaching. And again, we have so many people that tell us over and over, why don't you have millions of followers like this political commentator? Well, it's because we don't spend our time inflaming and supporting a faction or opposing another. We focus on reasoning and teaching, and we'll take the kind of tortoise versus hare approach on all this. And Washington talked about faction and parties as well. He said the alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid of enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. And sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. Now, Washington pointed out right after this, this is a far-off thing. But we are far off from that time, and I would say George Washington absolutely called it. One more from Noah Webster. I think tying this all together kind of tells us why he said, faction is death to liberty.
It's been really out of hand for a long time. The whole foreign policy is out of hand. It's gotten much worse because both Republicans and Democrats basically, they don't accept the non-interventionist philosophy. They believe that's our duty. We have an empire to defend and that sort of thing. So we have this obligation, and we have the hawks that want to go to war. We have the military-industrial complex that demand we go to war, and so on and on. But when this thing was stirring up, we had Ukraine to worry about, and then the antagonism between the Palestinians and Israel, that exploded. And now we have this whole thing that really is alarming. When you look at that picture, I had that up on one of our programs, I think yesterday or the day before, a picture of all the bases or places where we can shoot missiles out of Iraq. And we've been doing that. And I thought, holy man, I was pretty naive. I thought we were sort of trying to end the war over there. But deep down in my heart, I knew it wasn't going to end when we built the biggest embassy in the world ever in Iraq, that we were going to stay. So there's a lot of our activity over there, and we've been using it to fire at the Houthis, who have been interfering with trade and messing around with Iran. So this is something we have been doing, but it is escalating, and this is what we've anticipated that it would. So none of us should be surprised at what's happening. But in this recent episode of escalation, one of the biggest beefs, and we want to talk a little bit more about that, Chris, and that is we do these things. We have done these things, and we did this escalation because it was a major step where we really, literally started attacking directly the Iranians. So I would say this is very, very important, but They didn't even bother getting permission from Congress, let alone a declaration of war. So that's really where the problem. So the Constitution, unfortunately, has failed us on the war issue. Since World War II, how many wars have we been involved? We haven't ever declared a war. How much money have we printed against the Constitution? So it's the lack of respect for morality and the lack of respect for our Constitution that we have these problems.
Very good, Dr. Paul. Yes, it's very disappointing watching what our government does. It is completely unconstitutional, and it's so important. Our founders, they got a lot of things right. One of them is why Congress has to declare war. And the obvious reason is because nothing that the government does affects us more than war, more painfully. How many of us have grown up with grandparents and uncles that have been in war, whether it be the World Wars or Vietnam or even more recently in Afghanistan and Iraq? What it does to families, the PTSD, losing loved ones, and also the money that we've just totally wasted. And we're watching prices go up, our standards of living go down, the value of the dollar is worth much, much, much less than before these wars. So the purpose of Congress declaring war is we are supposed to, the people, have representatives. And they're supposed to understand their constituencies, whether or not we want to go to war. And they're supposed to put their name on the line. Yes, my people want to go to war. And that reflects one thing. A, it puts their name on the line. And B, it reflects that the public at least believes that war is necessary. And most importantly, the public is willing to sacrifice what is ahead, because war is nasty. And what do we have today? All of that is just thrown out the window. You have a tiny, tiny group of people that just go to war. And you read about it in social media. You see the videos. And the worst part is Congress is in the same boat. They're probably reading, but do they even know what's going on? A few of them are complaining that, hey, we didn't declare war in Yemen. So we have all, us and our representatives, been relegated to the sidelines. We're mere spectators. And our lives, our freedom, our money, our liberty is all being put into severe danger by a few people. And that is just absolutely wrong.
If you look at our spending, our finances, and our debt, and what's going on with our foreign policy, and we don't even know where the defense secretary is right now and what's going on. It is totally chaotic. And guess what that does? That knocks down the value of the dollar. The reserve currency of the world is being challenged. And so this is leading to the downfall eventually, of the empire. And that's not an astounding prediction, because I'm not saying it's next month or next year, but that's the way it works. So throughout all of history, there's been quite a few reserve currencies of the world, and then they get too big for their britches, and they want too much power, and they outreach too far, and that certainly has been the case. It certainly was the case with the Soviets, what they did, and it just folded. I'm just hoping when we just fold, it's as benignly as it was when the Soviets collapsed, because when we were worried about it more, and I was drafted in the 60s, there was true concern. What are we going to do? Are they going to start using nuclear weapons against each other? So I thought it was like a miracle that it ended, but I thought the miracle was damaged by after that. We never got the real peace dividend, and we're back at it now, bashing these countries. Same thing with China and Russia. What do we do? We're the chief architect of the world empire. So what we do now is, if you don't obey, you have two choices. You have do what we tell you, it will give you money. If you don't do what we tell you, we're going to bomb you. And that's been our foreign policy. It doesn't work. It leads to hatred directed toward us. It leads to the expansion of these wars and to our bankruptcy. And it takes a lot of waking up. But I think that's where we are today. I think more and more people are waking up. So, Chris, let's hope and pray that we can help and participate in that positive project.
Had a lot of, wars where you go into countries where they militarily can't harm you. But we're now, if you get into with Iran, Russia, China, now you're into big problems, and we can be harmed right here, right as where I'm sitting. I could be put into harm, and that is something that we're not used to, but we have to be aware of what's happening out there. Our country is being used around the world against enemies that we don't have to have. So it's very important to speak out against this. We can avoid it if we, do the right things, but it's going to take a significant effort.
Boy, wouldn't it be neat if we had a government didn't lie or steal from the people? What a bit of prosperity that would burst out if we had that. Let's work for that. Let's work for those results. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.
We've said that change is matter taking on new forms, or, alternatively, the same point, its potentiality being actualized. But now Aristotle wanted to know, how does this actually happen? Surely potentiality cannot actualize itself. Take the example of clay becoming a statue. or bricks becoming a house. Let us look more closely into the factors involved in any process of change, using those as an example, because we want to know what to look for to understand such a change. There must be something to understand because the bricks don't jump into a house just by themselves. How many factors are there involved in any change that we have to understand if we're to understand it fully? Aristotle answers in a famous doctrine, 4. 4 factors, which are called the 4 causes of a change. Now, cause here is aitia in Greek. It is not used in the modern sense fully, but in a broader sense. Cause for Aristotle means any factor that is necessary for a change to occur. Any answer to the question why. So, in effect, this is Aristotle's definition of why. What are you asking when you ask why? And he says there's 4 possible things you could mean, and only 4 possible answers. And the sum of those 4 answers is the complete answer to the question why. Now, if we take a specific example, let us suppose a man starts with some clay and molds it into a statue of Aristotle. Can we isolate the 4 factors? Well, one obvious factor is the clay we started with, the matter we started with, and that is the material factor, or what Aristotle calls the material cause. Now, obviously, we have the statue at the end of the change. In other words, the new form that we have imposed on the matter, and that will be the formal cause. But now something was required to get from the matter to the new form. Some agent to act upon the matter to transform it into the, well, to transform it is enough. Transform is our way of saying give it a new form. Some agent is required. In this case, of course, the molding actions of the sculptor. This is what Aristotle calls the efficient cause. Namely, the actual source of the motion, that which brings it about. Now, efficient here does not mean it does its work splendidly. Efficient comes from facio, a Latin root meaning to make. So this is actually the cause which makes the transition take place. And finally, says Aristotle, there is a 4th factor. The sculptor took these actions and shaped the clay for a purpose, an end, a goal. For instance, he wanted to decorate his apartment or the agora, or he wanted to commemorate Aristotle or whatever. He had, in other words, an end, in Latin fines, and thus the final cause, the purpose. So for Aristotle, there are really 4 senses of why. If I point to this statue now and say, why? Why is this a statue? You could say, because there was some clay around. That's the material cause. Or, because it's shaped like a human body. That is the formal cause. Or, because certain actions molded the clay. That is the efficient cause. Or, because somebody wanted to immortalize Aristotle. That is the final cause. So to understand a change fully, says Aristotle, you have to know 4 factors. The material you started with, the form it ended with, the agent which effected the transition, and the end or goal of the process. Change is a change from something, to something, by some means, for some end or goal. Now this should raise many questions in your mind. This is presented as a metaphysical analysis. So you should properly ask me at this stage, does Aristotle mean that the 4 causes apply to every change? Does every change have an end, or a goal, or a purpose? Is Aristotle then a teleologist, a universal teleologist like Plato? And if he is, how does he defend such a viewpoint? And of course, there's many other questions that we have left unanswered about Aristotle's metaphysics. What about the unmoved mover, Aristotle's so-called God? How does he fit in? And how does Aristotle, for instance, answer Zeno? Remember that you couldn't cross a room. What are Aristotle's views on infinity? And on other subjects. How does Aristotle defend the senses against the basic attack of the sophists? And what problems are there in Aristotle's philosophy to which he has no answer? And what about his psychology, his theory of the human soul and its relation to the body, and his ethics, and his politics? Now, the answers to all of these questions and still others constitute the subject of next week's lecture. So we will draw a line at this point for tonight. You have had at least a sample of Aristotle's all-encompassing genius and integrating power, enough, I trust, to hold you for one evening. In any event, that is all I can pack in for tonight. Thank you very much.